Ladies and gentlemen, today is January 28th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world with another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Foreign policy, current events, economics, history. We'll talk about anything, even movies. We begin with World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
I'm doing rather well. How about yourself?
Fat. Yeah.
Did you eat extra?
Today.
You just feel it?
I've just been snacking too much.
Oh, what are the go-to snacks?
I generally don't have too many, but for the past month or two, I've been kind of leaning into just whatever's around the house pretty much. A little bit of candy, a little bit of tortilla chips, maybe some ginger ale, maybe some root beer, just a lot of stuff that I don't need in my diet particularly.
But tastes good.
Yeah.
I hear that.
But otherwise doing fine.
Trish and I went to get some boba tea before streaming today. Just a little bit hyped up on
good.
Caffeine and sugar, yep.
It's probably even better in LA, right?
Boba's kind of the same everywhere, I would say. There are definitely a lot of places, and the nice thing is there's a spot that's walking distance, so I would say the accessibility is the improvement. Only downside today was they were out of the tapioca bubbles because someone probably showed up to work late and hung over and didn't start cooking them. Takes like maybe an hour. Yeah.
Is that right?
I think so. Maybe someone in chat knows better.
Tapioca bubbles.
Yeah. You've never had that before?
I didn't even know it was a thing.
What? Have you Googled it? Like, do you know what it looks like?
I mean, I know about boba, right? But
Yeah, that's what it is.
tapioca bubbles.
That's what boba's made of.
Oh, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. So that's what it is. Okay.
Yeah, you have to chew them. So it's like getting a drink where there's stuff in it that you chew. It's usually pretty weird for people the first time they try it.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember there was a big shortage of that stuff back during COVID. A lot of the ingredients, if not the stuff itself, came from, I think, Taiwan. Was the major source for a lot of American producers. And during the pandemic, a lot of that supply got cut off. It was pretty hard to find for a while as a result.
Yeah, chat's pointing out it's a more Asian export than from other regions. So if you go to a, say, rural, predominantly European area, you might not see any boba at all.
Yeah, I think the first time I encountered it was in grad school. UT Dallas has a lot of like Asian stuff around it, Asian restaurants and what have you, because there's a lot of students at the university from India and China. So I encountered, I think, boba tea for the first time at a cafe or something around the university.
Yeah, UT Dallas had really good STEM programs and stuff for the tuition prices relative to, say, UT Austin. So you could get a very similarly powerful degree for way less money.
Yeah, but had a strong STEM program. It was particularly known for computer science and business. Had a pretty good business program, as I recall.
We also had a super good chess team and the best women's basketball team for a bit, I think.
Oh, really? I didn't know about the basketball team.
Yeah. Yeah, I had joked around with people of like, we don't have a football team, so what's our main sport? And they're like, women's basketball. Okay, that's what we're good at. Fair enough.
Yeah, it was anyway, a pretty nerdy university. It was, they hadn't even taken on undergrad students until, like the 1990s or something? Before then, it had been purely a research university.
Yep.
So it didn't have much of a culture to it as far as student life and whatnot. And a lot of the people there were, either working while, older folks who were working while working on their degree, or they were pretty nerdy folks who didn't really get out much anyway. I think probably MOBA was a bigger sport than any normal physical sport at UT Tallis.
We had a StarCraft club.
There you go.
Yeah. There were like 13 people in it at the time. It's pretty cool. Very nerdy school. Very low level of school pride compared to older, more established schools. Like, we were apparently the Comets, but a lot of people didn't even know that was our mascot. And we didn't have a football team, which I would say that's the main place where people really get kind of whipped into a frenzy for school pride and so on. Kind of radicalized. So, very chill, more education-based school, I guess, unless you want to party, which you could party at any college and find a lot of people who are down. People who are young adults with the new freedom of not being around parents, you're going to try shit. Whether you're a nerd or not. One fun thing that Kukio and I did quite a few times was parkour around the place and climb on some of the buildings that were still under construction.
Yeah,
there's this huge dorm area that they were still building, and we were climbing and running around this place, and we saw someone like at the end of the hallway, and this is the middle of the night, and it's a building under construction, so we're like, oh shit, the cops. And then it turned out it was other students who were also trespassing at the same time. Fellow lawbreaker.
There you go.
Yep.
And you guys were always very active.
Mm-hmm.
Much more so than me.
Doing crazy shit. Kukio's very chaotic good, in the sense of he's totally fine to break some rules here and there if it's against someone who has a lot of power and could use sticking it to the man kind of a thing. He had that sort of energy, which I appreciate. I think I'm more lawful good in my alignment than him on average. Yeah. Heckin' Texas was one of the things that people were asking about before we got started today. I don't know if you saw any of that. It's border shenanigans, Abbott getting lots of conservative cred by saying he's going to make any sort of barrier there. I'm guessing some people are thinking Biden should step in and do something about it, but what is going on?
It's just election year posturing, like normal, pretty much.
Mm.
Yeah, it's every election year, every politician in America loses 20 IQ points.
Oh, no.
All of a sudden, it's all about getting in front of a camera and being seen to be doing something.
Mm.
Doesn't matter if it actually helps or not. They just need to be seen.
Uh-huh.
So, mating season for ideologues is what we have.
Gotcha.
And the result is some border shenanigans. I think there's a couple of things that have happened. So thing one, there was a park near the border. I can't remember what specific part of the border, where a lot of migrants were passing through, or illegal immigrants or undocumented migrants, whatever your preferred terminology. And the governor sent the Texas National Guard to occupy the park and deny access to the park to the feds, specifically to Customs and Border Patrol. And so he made a big deal about that, how he was going to make sure that the Texas National Guard was actually enforcing America's, border laws, immigration laws, and that the Biden administration, because the Biden administration was not, that is sort of the narrative that is very common here in Texas. And, it's not going to make a difference. Like the economic forces at play are going to attract migrants like any which way. They can catch some, but in reality, there's a lot that are going to get through regardless. There's just too much incentive to. People have very unrealistic expectations about the ability of any government, including the U.S. government, to just completely shut down and, quote unquote, safeguard what is 2,000 miles of border with Mexico? It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a very long border in the grand scheme.
It's longer than the
things.
border between a lot of countries, for context.
Yeah.
And it's also inhospitable terrain that's in the middle of nowhere, which kind of makes it more difficult to build shit there and navigate, because a lot of it's along a river. So the Rio Grande River is the geographical kind of barrier there, which I don't think is exact for the border, but it's pretty close. Like they use the river for a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was the park thing, and then there was a whole kerfuffle about supposedly there were some migrants who drowned in the river. Supposedly the Customs and Border Patrol saw them struggling, quote unquote, in the river and tried to go and investigate. The National Guardsmen at the park would not let them and said that they instead would investigate it. And supposedly nothing happened, and supposedly some people drowned, but it's not clear, why, or if the Texas National Guard really had anything to do with that, or if they checked it out and didn't find anything, or who knows. But that's been a partisan talking point correspondingly. So there's been that drama. I think some people were talking about the razor wire. The Texas government erected some some razor wire or some such along the border, I think in a river, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm thinking of a different incident. But the idea was that, the federal government allegedly wasn't doing enough to deter immigration, and so the Texas government took the initiative, quote unquote, and erected this barrier. And they did so without, notifying the federal government. And so, of course, there was a lawsuit because according to the Constitution, border powers are pretty much the exclusive enclave of the federal government. So unless there's some kind of agreement in which the federal government allows a state to do something along its border, they're not technically allowed to do that. So that, of course, was litigated. The Supreme Court ruled on it. I think they ruled on it recently that it was, in fact, not allowed, and that the Texas state government would have to take down the barrier in question, which was very predictable. I think everybody, including the Texas government, knew that was going to happen. Again, it's all just theatrics. Like, none of this stuff is even going to put a dent into migration coming into Texas and the United States. So this is just about winning votes at this point.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we've talked about with this Texas immigration talking point is no matter how razory your fence is, it loses to holes underground. So it's a little bit, like you're saying, seen to be doing something useful, which gets him in the spotlight. People are getting ready to vote and thinking about who they're going to vote for. He is out there doing stuff that conservatives love, so that's naturally going to get a lot of the red votes for him in Texas. And then for governorship, you can be governor as long as you want. How long has he been governor? A few rounds now?
10 years, I think. Does that sound right? I'd have to look it up.
I was in Texas during the Rick Perry era.
He of the Immaculate Hair. Yes, I remember him. Let's see. 2015. So yeah, about 9 years then. This will be the 9th year. So he's been around a while. Yeah, his attorney general is actually a lot more active, you might say. His name is Ken Paxton. He's been embroiled in a number of scandals, up to and including almost getting impeached. He was almost removed from office, I think, last year or so. There was a big scandal about money, but the charges did not end up sticking. A lot of it was political. He came back out and got a bunch of people to side with him, used his contacts. And so eventually people decided not to vote against him. So it didn't go anywhere. But he probably should have been. He's been implicated enough times in enough scandals that it's been a problem. Like, most other people would have resigned by now. But, this is Texas, land of the big ego. So, people refuse to take responsibility until they absolutely have no other choice. That's more of a norm in Texas politics than people would be willing to admit. So we're kind of stuck with him. And he has ambitions, too. He's probably more ambitious than Abbott is. But he hasn't run for governor yet. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Maybe a Senate run at some point. But for now, he's pretty content just to kind of run around and get into shenanigans in Texas as attorney general.
Chat's saying that there's more to the border thing and that it's being used by Africa and China to get into the U.S. or something.
I mean, used by China and Africa implies like governments are going out of their way to infiltrate the United States, which no, I don't think so. I haven't seen any substantive evidence to that effect.
They did send a weather balloon at us, though.
They did send a weather balloon. It could be happening. I can't rule it out completely. But, you know, if you want to infiltrate the United States, it's way easier just to do it on something like a tourist visa or something like that. Like, you can do it just legally and then overstay a visa, and there you go. Like, you don't have to cross a dangerous border and try to, you know, infiltrate Customs and Border Patrol or do all of that shit. Just, it's very easy if you can just get the plane ticket and a visa. So, you know, there's no need to, if you're like a spy agency trying to get people in, to do it like the more risky way, like a lot of the migrants are doing on the border with Mexico. More to the point, though, this person is pointing out something that is true, though, which is that it's not just people from Mexico and Central America who are coming up through the southern border now. There actually has been a steady rise in people from places like India, China, Africa as well, also Central Asia, you know, Afghanistan. All these kinds of places now are seeing people actually try to get into the United States via the southern border, which is a change. Historically, it's almost been exclusively people from Latin America, but now there's enough of an incentive. It's a combination of cheap enough and a combination of people having enough money in these other places to make that actually an economically viable move. I think for the most part, most people in places like Africa and Asia are still trying to get into Europe, but there is a non-zero proportion of that is trying to get into the United States now. Mm-hmm. So that much is true, and that does represent a structural change from what had defined patterns of migration across the southern border.
Interesting. So there was that one. Texas border shenanigans. What else was people talking about? Oh, Turkey letting Sweden into NATO?
Yeah, they've decided to vote them through. I have been gaslit so many times, though, over the past couple years about Sweden's chances of actually joining NATO that at this point, I'll believe it when I see it. So yes, the Turkish parliament did vote in Sweden. They've given them the go-ahead. They've still got to get Hungary's go-ahead. The Orban government says that they're going to vote for it sooner or later. Like, they were a bit cagey about the time frame for that. But Turkey had been one of the big obstacles. It was the one most people have been talking about vis-a-vis Sweden's NATO accession. So now that that's out of the way, people are kind of talking about it again. But we'll see. Like, I remember early 22, people were saying after the Ukraine war started that Sweden and Finland would be able to join in months. Like, that's what I was reading. And that did not happen. And there have been successive cases every couple of months since then where people have been saying, okay, well, now they're about to get in. And then the deal falls apart, or something happens, or suddenly there's a new reason for Turkey to oppose it. Like, just stuff kept happening. So at this point, maybe Sweden will join NATO. One of the significant obstacles has been removed, but it's still not finished yet. So we'll see how things actually pan out in practice. Eyes will now be on Hungary, so the ball's kind of in their court. Yeah, Finland, meanwhile, is already in.
Because they didn't burn as many holy books.
That's probably part of it, you know. But I think more to the point for Turkey was that there were a lot of PKK guys with links to the PKK in Sweden, whereas I don't think there really were any in Finland.
Oh, those are Kurds?
Yeah, that's the main Kurdish
Gotcha.
separatist group in Turkey. Sweden's asylum laws were a lot more liberal than Finland's, over the course of the past couple decades. So they ended up with, a lot more people from the Middle East. Finland, in contrast, has hardly any, so that's not really a thing for them. So that kind of removed one of the main adjutants for the Turkish government as far as Finnish accession. So there wasn't nearly as much drama about that, specifically for that reason.
Apparently the helicopter that's on Mars took damage and is grounded indefinitely, so space people are sad.
I have no idea. You guys keep asking me space questions. I have no idea. I don't follow it.
Well, maybe you should travel to space.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, but there's just so much goddamn violence right now around the world. And it's hard to keep track of all of it. No, here on Earth.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of different incidences of wars, civil wars, mass unrest, structural change in political coalitions and alignments, structural changes in the global economy. Like there's a lot going on, especially in the past couple of years. And so just keeping tabs on that takes up most of my bandwidth. Getting into the space industry has been something I've wanted to read about, but I just haven't really had time. It's not high up on the list of priorities. Unless Mars has an air force and wants to retaliate against Earth for landing a helicopter drone on it, I'm not going to pay too much attention to it.
I read another chapter in the American Nations book.
Oh, which chapter was that?
The one on the Scots and the Irish.
Yeah. What did you think of that?
That's so funny that basically whatever everyone's like expertise is kind of their battle plan, or I guess, or general approach to moving into a new world, dealing with natives and stuff. And because Scottish people had been basically harassed by the British Empire or Crown the whole time, they were very much like going at it with the physical damage approach to wherever they wanted to set up. They're really good fighters because they've had to for a long time. Yeah. And just seeing how they basically just go to the area where everyone else says don't go there because they're rebels, right? They had like super extreme independence as part of their ideology. So basically any area that was not set up in because it was difficult terrain or far away, that sounded like a really good thing to them. So they're like, sure, no one should go over the Appalachians. That belongs to the Crown. And they're like, actually, we hate them, so we're going to take that land.
Yep.
Very fuck you attitude.
Yeah. They were quite the disruptive force on the frontier for a very long time. Yeah, did you get to read about the siege of Philadelphia?
Yes. And how that really kind of pointed to the limiting factor of having Quakers as your leadership. Is they're super resolved pacifist, which means that if people are getting chopped up and murdered in the streets, you're like, well, I guess they weren't spiritual enough and that it was ordained or something. So a lot of people dislike that whenever you're being chopped up in the city streets. So that was one of the ways that Ben Franklin actually started making his name. He was already a pretty wealthy and well-to-do person at the time, but he was not happy about this. I really like his quote describing it, that people are allowed to come and go and take any booty unmolested. So people could just go in and take shit. It was kind of like, I don't know if raids are the right term, but there were definitely groups that would just go and attack and take stuff, and there was no police that would administer justice or militia or anything. It was a very soft and pacifist leadership. So yeah, that caused some problems.
Yeah, I remember the author wrote about how there was a war with the French, and there was fear about the French potentially attacking the colony, but the Quaker leadership didn't want to do anything about it. They didn't want to prepare like at all, and it turned into a big political kerfuffle at the time. Yeah, I appreciate that there are pacifists in the world, and I like that, that is sort of a part of the core identity of that region. But yeah, it definitely has its downsides. There's a lot of contradictions there that they were not able to square.
Yeah. Yeah, Quakers were really weird for the time. They're in some ways very American in that they wanted to pursue their own ability to practice their faith, and Quakerism was seen as kind of culty, mystical Christianity, and I would say it kind of still is by a lot of mainstream Christians and Catholics. Like, they do some weird stuff, and they're more inclusive of other people than I would say just mainstream Christianity, in that this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that they think that people have a divine spirit within themselves, and you don't necessarily have to be Christian to be connected to that. So it's less Jesus dependent as an offshoot of Christianity than a lot of types of Christianity, which obviously is going to upset any of the main branches. Like, Catholic Church hates them. The Puritans think that they're like way too free-spirited and weird and break lots of rules and stuff. So yeah, any hardliner is going to dislike Quakers. And being a very extreme pacifist is also kind of rare, because in the Bible there are a lot of stories of God telling the people to go and like siege a city, and they go and do that, and God blesses them and they take the city. That's a very aggressive move that is not pacifist, but it's biblical. So a lot of Christians have more of that kind of we can conquer shit too attitude, but the Quakers absolutely do not. It's like a I wouldn't hurt a fly kind of thing, even if I was being attacked. And I think that's the weird tipping point that most people disagree with. Most people, I think, agree that violence is wrong, but if you are using violence as a form of self-defense, that is justified. So that means that if you're governing some shit, you need to ultimately have some way to deal with bandits. You need to have some way to deal with murderers and thieves. And you also need to have a way to deal with rival factions and governments that are next to you. And that's whether you like it or not. Because if you don't make defense, anyone who plays Civ or StarCraft knows you will die to bandits early game.
Yeah.
As much as you like the idea of pacifism, some people don't believe in it.
Yeah, I know we have some people not from the United States who listen to this. So, you guys may not have ever heard of Quakers. So, for your benefit, like, to be fair, like, even a lot of Americans now probably don't know much about Quakers, because they haven't really been a principal religious force in the United States since probably the early 20th century. And even by then, they'd been in decline for a while. But they were religious idealists who, as Neuro just described, were very pacifist in their outlook and philosophy. And they were able to kind of make a home for themselves in the mid-Atlantic region of the East Coast in the United States. And they had a powerful influence on the formation of early institutions in the United States, especially in that particular region, but also at the national level. And they also had a big influence on the overarching culture. One of the main points of the book is that the first people to settle given regions of the U.S. Ended up having lasting influence, even when those groups kind of slowly were crowded out by subsequent waves of immigration. And the Quakers and their sort of pacifism and their insularity had a lasting impact on the U.S. Mid-Atlantic and the Midwest, which they kind of later settled. And sort of their notions of pacifism and isolationism influenced the United States to this day. It was kind of the Quakers that were the origins of those things. In part, significant contribution there. Yeah, they were called Quakers because one of their religious practices involved sort of shaking. They had this sort of ritual where they would commune with God, and they would shake their bodies or quake. And so they came to be known colloquially as Quakers. I don't know that they called themselves Quakers. I think that was a name that other people kind of gave them. I don't recall the technical name of their religion.
It's some like kind of universal Church of God or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's meant to kind of point to that we're more inclusive than other churches because it's about your connection with God. And because of that, they also don't require any of the established leadership or clergy of a lot of other religious groups. So the Anglican Church hates them, Catholic Church hates them, and Puritans hate them. So they're not really the most liked of the branches. The quaking that you're talking about, some Christian denominations still do that. It's called, kind of connected to speaking in tongues and stuff like that. A lot of charismatic churches will do that kind of thing. Charismatic Christians is what it's called. Yeah. I have an aunt who's kind of that vein, where it's almost like Christian magic. They do stuff that conventional Christians would kind of roll their eyes at or raise an eyebrow.
Mm. Yeah, I don't know that there's been a lot of Quakers who ended up in positions of power in the United States, as far as like presidents or CEOs or whatnot. But there were some prominent philosophers. Yeah, the names kind of escape me, but in the late 1700s and in the early 1800s, it was sort of Quaker logic and Quaker reasoning that sort of formed the basis for a lot of anti-slavery opinion and rhetoric in the United States. They were some of the leading anti-slavery advocates, abolitionists, I guess, in the United States at that time. And they continued to advocate for basically just less violence, just sort of a kinder, gentler version of America, where institutions were a little nicer, more broad-minded, and well-meaning in design. A little less harsh than what they frequently were at the time, and to some degree still are. Yeah, they were quite the high-minded group. Mm-hmm. But they ended up fading over time. A lot of people kind of just converted to other religions, or they stopped taking, their own religion seriously. That's just kind of a pattern. The longer, with any kind of new religion, unless it manages to become big enough to become like one of the world's main religions or denominations, they frequently struggle to last for too long. With the Quakers, I think maybe it was like 200 years or so, give or take. But they had a big impact while they were here. It's unfortunate we don't still have them around.
They still make some pretty mean oatmeal.
Oh yeah, granted.
Quaker oats.
I won't disagree with you. Yeah, it's. But yeah, I wish that their influence was still prevalent here in the United States, because given how things are now, we could use a dose of that.
Yeah. We're pretty aggressive at the moment in our stance and ideology. Currently, it feels like we're a lot more aggressive now than we were in the 90s or aughts, but I was also younger then and knew less about the world.
Yeah, I think institutions were healthier. Political norms were still relatively respected. You can see the decline over time. Mm-hmm. Like anybody, I think our age can kind of see over time how the politics just seems to get more extreme, more bombastic, and less conciliatory. Mm-hmm. There seems to be less and less reward for people who want to build broad coalitions that are predicated on give and take. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a broad sentiment that politics is inherently corrupt. It's a zero-sum game. And instead of trying to reform it, you should just game it to the hilt.
Yeah.
You should just try to bend it to your will and get as much as you can out of it.
That sounds pretty dark side to me, using a Star Wars analogy.
It is. It is. It's a self-destructively cynical outlook. Like, even if there is a lot of corruption, like, the effort should be at reforming it, not abusing it. But there doesn't seem to be as much of a market for that. Mm-hmm. People will talk about fighting corruption and making the government more accountable, but very few of the people who have been elected to do that have followed through. And they frequently have not really been punished for not following through. So we find ourselves at something of a crossroads in that regard. Mm-hmm. And I don't really know what the end game is. We'll see.
Yep.
Could go any number of ways. And right now, there's no clear-cut indicator of which way it's going to go. So we'll see what happens to the world's oldest experiment in self-governance. If nothing else, it'll be entertaining.
Yep, as our news cycle generally tends to be. Who needs reality TV when you've got this level of news? That's another thing that I think changed a little bit, is news being served as a more hype product as opposed to something more boring. Like, there used to be the Comedy Central kind of era of where that was the channel where politics was made fun of and really silly. Mm-hmm. And then now the main news organizations do those things about the other side. So it's sort of like we became the joke. You are
unfortunately so.
Yeah.
Did you see Jon Stewart is coming back to The Daily Show?
No. Huh.
Yeah, it's not going to be permanent. He's just going to be doing Mondays, from what I read.
Cool.
But he will be back, and I think he is going to be executive producer again.
Cool.
He ought to run for president. It wouldn't be any dumber than anything else that's happened over the past 20 years. So we might as well.
Yeah. I think it would be a better situation. Vote in just openly TV people like Zelensky.
Yeah, there you go.
He got acting experience with the job. That means he can really do it.
Apparently. Here we are.
Yep. We have Weeser in the chat, who is from Ukraine. Is it still kind of status quo over there?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there's not a lot changing in terms of the front lines. There are little incremental gains here and there. I think mostly by Russia over the past couple months. The Russians have been making have been applying pressure, let's say, in eastern Ukraine, in and around Donetsk and north of Donetsk. And they've made some gains there over time, but it's like a village here, a town there. You know, it's nothing too big. It's still very grinding as far as the pace of the conflict at this point.
Yeah, no major decisive battles then.
Yeah, and it's not clear when the next big push will be. You know, Ukraine kind of exhausted itself with the big counteroffensive late last year. And the Russians, maybe they've got the resources to make a big push. They're kind of making a push now, but I don't know that I would describe it as a big offensive. You know, I imagine that they have more that they could apply if they wanted to. But it's not really clear. You know, they're obviously very cagey about just what the status of their forces is. The status of their forces in Ukraine is, and their readiness. So it's a little hard to judge. But, you know, they could have something planned for spring or summer. I think that's more likely than anything from the Ukrainians at this juncture. Yeah, it's going to be a long year for Ukraine, most likely. You know, because they're going to have to reconstitute the forces that they lost and otherwise try to mobilize more people to try to replace losses and to build up forces in order to try to make another push at some point, or at the very least try to put themselves in a decent enough position where some kind of negotiations could start, which is unlikely. But they're going to do better in whatever negotiations happen if they're stronger. In whatever negotiations happen if they're stronger than if they're weaker. So, you know, there is going to be more mobilization, almost certainly, to some degree. So they're probably going to be focused mostly on consolidation for the next year, I would guess. The Russians, you know, God knows. I mean, the Russian government has said that they don't want to do further mobilization, which seems kind of strange to me. That's supposed to be their big advantage, right? They have like way more people. So, you know, if they could mobilize more, then they could really leverage that. But it seems the Russian government isn't that interested. So make of that what you will. Maybe they'll do it low-key. Like maybe they'll just go for more like prisoners and, you know, their penal battalion shit. I don't know. And they do get volunteers. So, you know, maybe they're getting a decent supply of volunteers that's allowing them to build up forces. But for what I've read, they're still taking fairly heavy losses. You know, I mean, both sides are really, but If the Russians aren't going to take mobilization seriously, I'm not sure how they're going to reach a critical mass in terms of numerical superiority, which is what they'll need in order to achieve some kind of big breakthrough. To be fair, it may just be the case that they don't have the resources to mobilize large numbers of people. It actually does cost a lot of money and equipment. It costs a lot of money in terms of equipment and ammunition and food and whatnot to mobilize large numbers of people. And there's also the opportunity cost in terms of the hit on the economy, since all of the, most of those guys they would be mobilizing are going to be like working age guys in the prime of their working lives. So, taking those guys out of the economy is going to do some damage in that regard. So, it's not cheap. And the Russian government, even though the economy has not collapsed, like some people were talking about back in 22, it's still not in great health either. The Russian government has kind of overstated how robust their economy is. They've managed to free ride mostly on, one, natural gas exports along with oil exports, and also, probably more importantly, two, which is a relatively ineffective sanctions regime. It could hit a lot harder. I was fully expecting last year, for Europe in particular, to really clamp down on sanctions. And there were a couple new rounds of sanctions that were applied, but nothing overly rigorous either. There's an analyst for the Wilson Institute who comes from Russia, actually. He's ethnic Tatar. I think his name, Kamil Galiyev, I think his name is. He's been making a persistent argument over the past several months, if not longer, that supply chains that attach Russia's arms industry to Europe should be targeted much more heavily by sanctions, and that up till now they largely have not been effective, and in a lot of cases have not even really been enforced. I mean, just open source intelligence analysis. Just by doing open source intelligence analysis, he's shown that there's a lot of stuff made in Europe, machinery especially, critical to the manufacture of things like gun barrels for artillery and tanks, for example, that has been exported to Russia despite the sanctions. And it wasn't like something that was, ordered before the war and was delivered after it started. Like they've continued a pretty steady business despite the conflict and despite the fact that doing so is illegal. So that has been a source of frustration for a number of the people in Europe who are advocating for a much more rigorous program of support for Ukraine. It just doesn't seem like the politics add up. It seems like for every step forward, there's a step back in that regard. So, if Europe really wanted to take it seriously, and I might add the United States, they could do a lot more. But right now, the political calculus is not in favor. The Eastern Front, Donetsk and Lugansk in Ukraine, and Zaporizhia, these are that's the main front of the war. But the other big front is in Europe and the United States, the politics. Because it's the politics of Ukraine and aid to Ukraine that are a major factor in Ukraine's ability to continue to prosecute the war. And it's looking a little dicey. Like there is not insignificant fatigue in the West. There is still sympathy for Ukraine, but more and more polling is suggesting that people think that the money is too much. People think a lot of people are getting to think that it's too costly, and that there should be more focus on a diplomatic solution, which is hilarious if you're familiar with the Russian government's position on the conflict, which apparently a lot of people who think that are not. Moscow is not interested in a negotiated settlement that does not involve capitulation on the part of Kiev. And the Russian interest in doing so, that is to say, engaging in a negotiated settlement, is especially sparse given that they have momentum right now. They can win a lot of what they want just by continuing to fight. And a lot of the Russian strategy is predicated on the West giving up and just saying, well, we don't want to do this anymore, so we're just going to cut down aid or maybe even cut off aid. Mm-hmm. And in that case, it's going to be really hard for Ukraine to continue to defend itself. So, if that's the case, if the Russians are right, why negotiate a peace? There's no incentive. Their strategy seems to be working, and their position in Ukraine is, not unassailable, but the lines have not changed. So they could just hang on and kind of get a sort of strategic default victory here with relatively little effort on their part beyond what they've already expended. So, that could be how they win. Just sort of sit in place, drag the conflict out. And when the West quits, then you can just kind of either roll over Ukraine or wait for Ukraine's arms and supplies to basically just expend, and then you can force them into a position where they have to negotiate. One of the two, or something to that effect. Either way, it's not going to end great for Ukraine, most likely. And there's not going to be a deal if that happens in which the status quo, that is to say, an independent Ukraine, fully free and sovereign, is going to persist. Like, there's no reason for the Russian government to want that. That's very clearly not an objective for them, to continue to allow that. Going back to 2014, it's not even really about NATO. It was about the European Union at the time, right? The European Association Agreement. The European Union Association Agreement. That was the catalyst for Euromaidan. So having a Ukraine that can just freely associate and enter agreements with, the European Union or anybody else, Moscow doesn't want that. It wants a de facto veto. And it's not going to get that so long as there's nationalists of any kind in power. So invariably, there's going to be some kind of institutional break on Ukrainian sovereignty that will be reintroduced. They actually had that already. There were a lot of people in Ukraine, before 2014, and even to a degree after, who were very sympathetic to Russia and voted for pro-Russian political parties. And those parties were significant enough in Ukrainian politics to make NATO accession impossible. It was not going to happen. They did not have the votes. And then Moscow pissed all of that away. Because when they took Crimea and when they invaded Donetsk and Lugansk, those were the main pro-Russian regions. So now the pro-Russian political position in Ukraine's legislature has been gutted, and there's not nearly as many pro-Russian voices. So that being the case, Russia had significantly less influence in Ukraine afterwards than it did before. I've made this point before. Moscow could have achieved all of its objectives in Ukraine without intervening in 2014.
Yeah, they also, I'm thinking about a sort of economic way of winning where they back up the politicians, they boost their campaigns, they go for that kind of an edge where it just makes the country more and more within the sphere of influence, which I think that's kind of what they want, or at least what Putin wants at the end of the day, is he wants Ukraine in his sphere of influence, really hardcore. And he's going about that in the aggressive combat way, but you could also go about that in the, we're just going to make a bunch of deals with you in a way that you're more entangled with us and we have more control over the region. That would be a softer approach.
Yeah, and that's what they had been doing, and that was working, right? Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO. They didn't have the votes in their parliament. European accession was more probable, and there was a lot of talk about that, but in the end, it was too controversial, right? There was a lot of people that didn't want it, but there was enough people that did want it that it probably would have gone through, and that was the line for Moscow. So it was never about national security for them. It was about influence, like you say, a sphere of influence that they wanted Ukraine to be in. And that's what they're fighting over, effectively. And it's not going to solve anything. That's one of the most frustrating things about it. It's not like getting Ukraine in Russia's sphere of influence is going to resuscitate Russia economically. It's not. Ukraine has a lot of the same problems that Russia has economically, like corruption, demographic decline, industrial decline. They're pretty similar in profile in that regard. Ukraine was willing to try to address those issues by trying to integrate with the European community, which has higher standards for anti-corruption, try not to laugh, and also has a more robust economy with more opportunities. And the prospect of integration offered the prospect of things like foreign investment, education opportunities, etc. The whole plethora of economic benefits from being part of the European single market. Yeah, it's not a panacea, but it offers a path forward. Russia, in contrast, has been very resistant to implementing those kinds of policies. Obviously, Russia joining the European Union has always been pretty unlikely, but they could have imposed, or implemented rather, economic reforms that would have been pretty similar to the reforms that they would have had to implement in order to join the EU. And those reforms would have benefited the Russian economy. But they would not have benefited the elite. the Putin government and his extended patronage network don't benefit from those kinds of reforms because they're inherently decentralizing reforms. So that was not in the cards for them. But that means, by extension, that if they're not going to, reform the Russian economy and generate growth that can propel Russia into the 21st century, forcing Ukraine to also not implement those kinds of reforms just means that they're condemning Ukraine to the same fate. Mm-hmm. It's not going to make both of them better and stronger. It just means that they're in the same disintegrating position, rather. The trajectory of the Russian economy has not been altered in that regard. It's true that the Russian economy has grown in terms of overall production, but most of that is just the arms industry. It's the old guns and butter trade-off. It would be a lot better to just focus on industry, commercial industry, consumer goods, what have you. Russia did that in the 90s. And the 90s were an absolute mess for Russia, but the economy did improve over time. And by the time you get into the aughts, with the recovery of commodity prices, Russia was looking pretty good. But then they threw it away. Like, why? Who has benefited from that shift? And that happened relatively recently. That happened like 2010, roughly. Right? There was a guy named Alexei Kudrin, who was the main economic advisor for a long time in the Russian government. And his thing was that, he made space for the patronage network. He understood that wasn't going to go away. But he did propose lots of relatively market-oriented reforms and policies that were able to keep the economy going and modernizing. Overall, his influence was a pretty positive force. But around 2010, he ended up getting marginalized. And instead, you get all of these sort of weird Vatnik gym bros getting into the inner circle of Putin's patronage network. And they had a much more autarkic vision for the Russian economy. Their vision was one of self-sufficiency, quote unquote, which is every nationalist's favorite pipe dream, autarky, being completely self-sufficient. It hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen. But they still keep trying. And Russian nationalists were no different. Starting like around 2010, there was a slow motion deviation from what had been the relative consensus in Russian elite circles, which is that they needed to have some market reforms continue in order to grow the economy. That changed. And the Russian economy has not been in a good state since. Obviously, the sanctions in 2014 and 22 have hurt the Russian economy as well. But even before then, it was in decline. And it was frustration with that decline that was part of the reason that the Putin government ended up getting paranoid. Like it was the elections in like 2010 or 2011, I think it was, where Putin's support, his popularity dropped to below 70% for the first time. And there were widespread allegations of fraud in that election as well that set a lot of people off. And there were some protests. And that was enough to shake up the government that it started thinking about changing things. And unfortunately, one of the things they decided was necessary was to shift away from a relatively more liberal approach to governance towards a more autocratic approach. They wanted to crack down. They thought that was necessary, if not smart. Given how cynical the vision of governance and politics is among Russian elites, they do frequently characterize these kinds of hawkish crackdowns as being, quote unquote, smart governance.
Once again, very physically violent and aggressive approach to the problem. There are also softer hand approaches you can take. Or you can just throw people out of windows. That's also an option.
They had decent governance. Russian governance has never been great. But, over the course of the aughts, as the economy recovered, they were doing well overall. And the trajectory was positive. That was the general sentiment amongst most of the people, from what I've heard and read. And then they just decided to just completely change it. Like, they just went in the total other direction. And it's just been sad. Like, they've destroyed a lot of what they had built over the course of the 20 years after the Cold War. And, there's nothing to show for it. There's no long-term benefit to doing that. They're just going to have to do it again later. So what's the point? But to be fair, you could say that about a lot of activities in a lot of countries in the 2020s. So let's not single out Russia in that regard.
Yeah.
being self-destructively obstinate seems to be the theme among many in the 2020s.
I did see a viewer in the chat who said that they are Ukrainian living in the US and they have a Russian girlfriend, once again proving that this is not a war that Russia as a country has decided upon. This is one that is being foisted upon them. Lots of propaganda around though, but they're neighbors. They should be friends.
They have a lot in common, culturally speaking. The nationalists in Russia are right about one thing, which is that historically Ukraine and Russian cultures have been intertwined and have heavily influenced each other, and that they very frequently have common frames of reference culturally in terms of things like mass media, literature, et cetera. These sort of common frames of reference are very frequently held in common between them. So, they're right about that. But they seem to be very hawkish in their desire to ring fence those commonalities and prevent any kind of deviation, which is crazy. Like, you can't do that. Cultural influence and interchange is very organic. It's not something that you can really just dictate from above. You can try, but you're just going to end up strangling it and just depriving it of any and all creative oxygen.
Mm.
We hope for better situations over there. But it will probably take a minute.
Yeah, that's going to take a minute. Well, I don't really have anything in the way of big updates on Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I did kind of read through some articles trying to piece together what the time frame for artillery shell production is in the West, because that's been treated as a major marker of Western support. Mind you, the war in Ukraine is mostly an artillery war. Both armies have, as part of their core doctrine, a heavy reliance on artillery. And so counting artillery shells as far as how many they have available for the war, that's been a point of frequent debate among analysts. So for what I've read, Russia is producing something to the effect of, what was it? I think it was 4 million a year. Mind you, this is sort of the main type. Obviously, there's different sizes of artillery shell, especially for Ukraine, which has a multitude of different artillery systems from different countries at this point. But the main one for Ukraine is 155 millimeter shells. That's the kind they use for their heavy artillery, and that's the main one that they depend on. So when you see people talking about shells being supplied to Ukraine, frequently they're talking about 155 millimeter. From what I've read, the equivalent for Russia is 152 millimeter, if I'm not mistaken. So generally, Russian numbers cite that particular caliber. So that said, let me try to find it. Yeah. Okay, so in 2024, Russian production is projected to increase up to 4.5 million units a year. So that's what we're looking at. And if I'm not mistaken, what is that? That's about 300K a month. Yeah, it's 360K a month, roughly. So from what I've read, Ukraine, in order to kind of stay roughly at par with Russia in terms of the availability and usage of artillery, is about 200,000 rounds of artillery a month, which comes out to about 2.2, or what is it? Yeah, 2.4 whatever million shells a year. And Ukrainian production of shells is relatively sparse, so they rely pretty heavily on imports of shells in order to fill those needs.
Military question, do they need artillery shells as much as Russia does, based on their strategic position? That's one thing that I'm not sure about, because Russia's trying to hit cities and shit. Is Ukraine not in need of as many artillery shells, or?
Well, Russia hits Ukrainian cities with ranged fires like missiles and drones and stuff. They're not using artillery for that. Artillery is used tactically. So, if you want to launch an offensive, first you shell the area you're attacking heavily, and then you move in.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, there's not much resistance since most of the defenders have been killed. It very rarely works like that in practice, but That's the idea. And that's been doctrine in the Russian military for decades, even when it was the Soviet Union. They call artillery the god of warfare, in Russia. So their whole approach to land warfare is pretty heavily centered on, the usage of artillery. And Ukraine's military has tried to, modernize and kind of move away from the Russian approach. But, the reality is that a lot of their officers were educated using the traditional Russian doctrine in that regard. So even though they have more people who are educated in the West and who have a more dynamic view of how to conduct land warfare, most of their guys are still using the artillery-centric approach. Mm-hmm. So that's why artillery is very important, besides the fact that it's mostly land war. And of course, in a land war, artillery will invariably be very important. But it's especially important given that both sides lean on it to conduct both offensive and defensive operations. If you're wondering, what the alternative is, how else would it be? Maneuver warfare is much more the emphasis in the West. Artillery is used more to support maneuver warfare rather than, the other way around, where you just lean on artillery and then try to move into the vacuum that you create with it. So Ukraine kind of tried to do that to a degree at the beginning of its counteroffensive in 23. They tried to do some maneuver warfare, but there was a lot of problems as far as leadership on a unit level, I think specifically a battalion and brigade level. A lot of the officers just weren't that experienced in how to do it. And so they struggled, and there were a lot of problems with timing, coordination, joint operations, things like that. Stuff that's kind of like bread and potato, meat and potatoes rather, in the United States and Western militaries, but it's still kind of stuff that's being learned amongst the officer corps in Ukraine. And so the result is that after the first week or two, they ended up sort of defaulting to the previous artillery-centric mode of warfare that they were more used to, which a lot of Western advisors didn't really like, but the Western way wasn't working for them. And so they went with what did. And, unfortunately for Ukraine, that didn't pan out. But again, like we discussed at the time, that was always the most likely outcome. Like the first big offensive was not going to be like a smashing success. Mm-hmm. So that's why artillery is so important, hence the emphasis on artillery shells and whatnot. So the Western production of artillery shells is actually really sparse. We had largely, how should I put this? We had largely degraded our ability to produce artillery shells over the course of the past 30 years. Because after the Cold War, it wasn't thought that you would need a lot. It was thought that conflicts that the West was most likely to end up in were largely counterinsurgencies or interventions into developing countries, conflicts of that sort. And you don't need like massive surpluses of artillery shells for conflicts like those. And so the industrial base relevant to the production of artillery shells was shrunk correspondingly to a point that only maybe like 10, 20,000 a month could be produced in most of even the leading economies in NATO, which is not nearly enough to meet the 200,000 a month that is projected to be needed by Ukraine, that is estimated rather to be needed by Ukraine. So one of the things that's happened since the war in Ukraine has started is that there's been a big effort to invest in those kinds of productive facilities. That is to say, factories that produce 155 millimeter shells in particular. And it's been slow, slower than proponents were hoping for. A lot of that comes down to contracting. There's a lot of Byzantine rules and regulations about who you can contract with, who can make bids. Bidding processes itself is a whole thing. And some of the process got kind of bogged down in some of that stuff. Also, a lot of producers were hesitant because they didn't know how long the war was going to last, and they didn't want to make huge investments in expensive factories that they were only going to end up using to produce stuff for maybe a year or two, because that would not be enough to cover their costs, for the investment. So as the war kind of dragged out and it became apparent it was most likely going to be a long war, some of that hesitancy went away. Now there's much more confidence that such investments will in fact get a return.
They'll need a lot of equipment.
Yeah. But the scaling up has taken time. We're 2 years in now, and we're only now getting to a point where we can kind of get close to meeting Ukraine's demand. We're still a ways off. From what I was reading, the collective efforts by the entire NATO alliance in order to increase artillery shell production will be enough to meet that 200,000 a month number by 2025. So it'll take most of 22, 23, and then 24, about 3 years for us to kind of reach that point. And in the meantime, Russia has been not only producing what they need, but significantly more than 200,000 a month. And they could scale up further if they want. I don't know if they have the resources or the ability to do so, but that'll certainly be something they'll be looking at. Yeah, if you want to break down, in 23, most of the artillery shells did not come from NATO at all. Or I should say NATO members. It actually came from South Korea. South Korea sent probably between 500,000 to 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine over the course of 2023. And, it's somewhat ironic, maybe not ironic, but it's kind of funny because Russia, in the same time period, ended up getting a roughly similar number of artillery shells from North Korea. You may remember in roughly summer 23, Putin went to North Korea and held some negotiations with Kim Jong-un. And the result of that was an agreement in which North Korea would supply a whole shit ton of artillery shells. So interestingly, the Ukraine war kind of turned into a proxy war between South Korea and North Korea to a degree. Fate kind of has a sense of humor in that regard. Very much the other way around at one point in history, but now the shoe is on the other foot. So North Korea is supporting one side economically, and South Korea is supporting the other side economically. I would point out that South Korea has been a bit cagey about supplying those weapons. They say that it's not allowed. They don't want to appear partial to the outcome of the conflict because they're concerned about potential escalation vis-a-vis North Korea and Russia's support for North Korea. But in practice, they're actually not really giving a shit about that. They've been pretty content to make a lot of money off of the supply of artillery shells, among other forms of military equipment. Poland, for example, since the war started, has significantly invested in a military buildup, and a lot of the stuff they're buying actually comes from South Korea, or is going to come from South Korea. So Seoul can make all the protestations it likes. I notice that they don't seem to amount to much in practice. They're exporting a lot and making a lot of money, and I suspect that's going to be the main determinant of their behavior going forward, regardless of legality. So the Koreas had a big influence on the war in so much as they were able to keep both combatants going. Significant infusion of artillery shells that likely powered the respective combatants' offensives over the course of 2023. Now, there's an important caveat here, which is that those infusions were probably one-off infusions. They're probably not going to be repeated because most of that was not newly produced artillery shells. Rather, most of it came from inventories. So both South Korea and North Korea had large inventories of artillery shells that they were willing to part with. But now that they parted with them, they can't do it again. Right now, they can only send the new stuff that they can produce, and the rate that they can produce it at is much lower than what they were producing before, what they were sharing before over the course of 23, rather. So through 2024, most likely most of the artillery shells both combatants will be using will be stuff that was produced within the past couple months, either in their own factories or in factories overseas. In 2024, production should be higher, but it's not quite going to be enough. Over the course of 23, U.S. artillery production, again, 155 millimeter, was about 28,000. And that sort of changed over the course of the year, but by the end of the year, it was 28,000 a month, which is enough for 336,000 annually. Again, the target number for Ukraine is 2.4 million annually. That's enough for 200K a month. the math is probably wrong. I don't remember, but about 200K a month. So they're still well short of that. Germany, in contrast, by the end of 2023, produced about 400K total, which is pretty decent. And that's going to scale up too over the course of the next year. So between them, by the end of 23, the USA and Germany had the capacity to supply a combined 700K a year. Still well short, but kind of getting there. And there's other countries in Europe that have also been producing. So, it's kind of a team effort. But Germany, the US, these are sort of the main suppliers for Ukraine thus far. South Korea notwithstanding. So in 2024, the hope is that by the end of the year, the US will be able to produce 1.2 million shells annually. And Europe collectively is aiming to be able to produce 1 million annually by the end of the year. So that should pretty much put us on target. By the beginning of 2025, the US and Europe together collectively should be able to produce enough to meet the 200K a month target for Ukraine. Ideally, it would be even higher, because the more shells you send, the more offensive capability that they'll have and the more ability to conduct offensive operations. So they're going to continue scaling up even after they surpass that number. But it's just going to take a while. And in the meantime, Ukraine pretty much just has to hang on. There's already shortages of ammunition being reported. Some of that has to do with the lack of support package coming from the US and Europe. In both the US and Europe, there's been a lot of politics about continued aid to Ukraine, and the result has been delayed aid packages. And that is starting to have some impact on the ground there. We'll see if it continues. A lot of that grandstanding could just be bluster on the part of opponents, but maybe it's not. From what I've read, Donald Trump is fairly critical about the war in Ukraine and Western involvement therein. And supposedly he made some phone calls to some congressmen saying that he did not want them to allow the aid package to go through. Mm-hmm. So that suggests that there's a chance that there may not be further aid to Ukraine, which obviously would have a pretty dramatic effect on the ultimate outcome, presumably.
Yeah, so that makes our election relatively important. I don't know what the stances are of other candidates who are running, but Biden would be the status quo man, which is how he was elected in the first place. And then, he's probably going to win the Democratic primary. Trump will probably win. We'll probably have a repeat of that one. That's what we're feeling.
We'll see.
Yeah.
I'm hoping it won't. Go ahead.
A lot of people don't know this, but the U.S. always puts their two oldest people up against each other for president.
Yeah, it kind of feels like it, doesn't it? Yeah, we'll see. I'm hoping it won't be as dramatic as the 20 election. I'm not really in the mood for further drama.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think everybody's pretty tired of the 2020s roller coaster at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see. We shall see. Even temperament has been a pretty rare thing in the 2020s so far, so I'm not optimistic.
Yes, tensions are high. You have a very interesting Twitch chat that you'll get to read after this.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
What particular variety of drama are we talking?
It's talking about the Ukraine situation.
Oh, okay.
Basically, the different forces of propaganda and so on. I think we have quite a few people from Ukraine in the chat tonight. I don't know if it shows it on the flag thingy.
Yeah, it's not loading. I've noticed it's had trouble loading lately for some reason.
Oh, it's showing for me. Let's see. Ranking. 42 US, 11 Canadians. We did just get a Jason raid. 2 from Russia. I don't see anyone showing the Ukraine flag, but a lot of people use a VPN or they just don't share their location, which is valid.
Okay. Yeah, I opened up a new tab, so I can see it now.
the U.S. is going to get involved because there was a strike in Jordan that killed 3 Americans?
It's just a tit for tat thing.
Oh.
I wouldn't read too much into it. It is significant that Americans died, and that does mean that the retaliation will be relatively more significant, but neither the US government or the Iranian government is actually that interested in fighting a big conflict over Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
They do want to posture over it so that they can look good, but beyond that, they're not actually going to go to the mat. That seems to be the consensus I've noted amongst analysts. There is a concern among analysts about the possibility of an out-of-control escalation into conflict that neither side actually wants. But the fact that neither side wants the conflict, to me, suggests that it's pretty unlikely. I don't think it's going to happen. So more likely you're just going to see little cuts here and there, a drone attack here, an airstrike there, maybe the occasional suicide bombing, a rocket attack, more attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, just sort of casual Middle Eastern style violence. It's the kind of violence you're seeing right now is not really the prelude to war, knock on wood.
It's like the resting aggression level is that.
Yeah. This is more political, negotiating, diplomatic style violence of a kind that's unfortunately very familiar in the region and has been getting even more familiar over the past 10 years. So, when you see these kinds of attacks, don't think of it as the United States and Iran fighting each other. Just think of it more about the United States and Iran signaling to each other. Very violent signaling to each other. Because that's what it amounts to.
Mm-hmm.
So the level of drama that I would then read into them is relatively mild. Like it's an issue. I would keep an eye on it, but I'm not overly worried about it.
Interesting. Oh, there was another thing that I guess was a talking point for some people here in LA is the conflict in the Congo. Do you know if there's anything going on there? I don't know shit about that.
Yeah, I do, but I'm more just shocked that people in LA care about it. Like, what was the impetus for that conversation?
People posting about it on social media, in Trisha's friend group and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do they have African friends? Like, what's the deal there?
No, just friends with some activists, I guess, in general, and that's something that people are about. People in LA definitely have strong opinions on the Israel-Palestine thing, and they're usually a hardliner for one side if they have anything to say at all.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's basically just the latest chapter in a conflict that's been going on since the 1990s, which is that the Rwandan government props up and supports rebels in eastern Congo, specifically, I think, North Kivu province, I want to say. And they use them as proxies by which to exert influence, in the area, but also to make money, since there's a lot of minerals and whatnot in the area. I think people call them conflict diamonds sometimes, although I don't think it's diamonds in North Kivu, though. But it's the same idea. Basically, they mine for stuff in North Kivu, and some of the proceeds are kept by the local militias and whatnot. But a good chunk of the money ends up in the Rwandan government as a kind of payout in exchange for continued support to the militias in the area. Yeah, this kind of goes back to the Rwandan genocide, without kind of reviewing all of that. But basically, it was ethnic Hutus versus ethnic Tutsis. And it was the Tutsis who were getting slaughtered, but eventually a Tutsi army that had been created in exile, I think across the border in Uganda, formed up and invaded Rwanda, and they were able to successfully overthrow the government and seize power. And the result is that a number of Hutu militias fled Rwanda across the border into North Kivu. And supposedly there was some raiding. They were continuing to raid Rwanda in order to try to get back into power. So the Rwandan government retaliated by sending its army into North Kivu. DR Congo didn't like that. So the Rwandan government ended up allying with some other rival local militias. And the result then was a big proxy war that kind of escalated from there into a much bigger conflict that killed 1 million some people. It's one of the bigger conflicts in the 1990s that you don't hear much about because it happened in sub-Saharan Africa. And, stuff that happens in sub-Saharan Africa might as well happen on the other side of the moon if you're somebody living in the West, because there's very little reporting on it here.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a big conflict, and at the end of the conflict, DR Congo maintained its territorial integrity. It did not really retain its sovereignty. Not only did the Rwandan army, in conjunction with its militia allies, basically defeat the Hutu militias in North Kivu, they also marched all the way to the capital of DR Congo and deposed the government. Pretty impressive, given how small Rwanda is, but they pulled it off, and they installed a much more favorable candidate into the office of DR Congo's presidency, who was much more malleable to their interests. And so the result then was off and on conflict between this, that, and the other local militia in eastern Congo. A lot of them supported by Rwanda, some of them not. And, the DR Congo government was present, but it was kind of a third wheel in the region. So, not really all that present. Ultimately, what ended up happening was a UN peacekeeping mission was dispatched. And it's been there pretty much ever since, in order to try to separate the militias and maintain the peace. Middling success for maybe the first 10 years. I think everybody was kind of tired after the big war in the 90s. But then after that, there was kind of a big flare-up. Yeah, generally what happens is every 10 years or so, the Rwandan government gets ambitious, and they give their allies in eastern Congo enough resources to launch a big offensive, and then there's a big flare-up in fighting. So that happened around 2010. The UN actually authorized their people to go in and launch offensive operations, which is unusual for UN peacekeeping operations. Normally, they are pretty passive in the face of aggression. You kind of saw that at Srebrenica in Bosnia, unfortunately. But in the case of Eastern Congo, the UN gave them the green light. They let them go ham, and they were able to successfully conduct offensive operations to, not destroy Rwandan-supported militias, but to, put them in their place. They were able to subdue them, prevent an escalation in fighting, and eventually restore the status quo.
So why would people be upset about that? Like, do they not think the UN should have done that? Or I guess I'm wondering.
Well, nobody was upset about it. Oh. Again, most people didn't even notice it.
Well, fair.
But it was not that controversial at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, more recently, a couple of years ago, there was another big flare-up. The Rwandan government did the same thing. They, goosed supplies to their militia allies in eastern Congo. They started fighting again, they escalated, the normal baseline fighting. And so the UN had to conduct offensive operations again. And they were successful. The fighting died down. But afterwards, there started to be, and this is unrelated to the fighting, the fighting died down, status quo returned. But then in the aftermath, there was a number of scandals that happened. The UN mission in DR Congo has always been in a little bit of trouble for one reason or the other. Reports of deployed soldiers and, availing themselves of local prostitutes, including, underage girls. That's not been uncommon.
Yikes.
People engaging in trafficking, soldiers, that is to say, engaging in trafficking or profiting from various side operations, side businesses that are, very frequently very illegal in nature. Things like that have undermined the legitimacy of the peacekeeping operation. And people were kind of willing to look the other way for a long time, but eventually the scandal started to compound, and they reached critical mass probably in the past year or two.
And it's the UN that's doing this?
Yeah, it's a UN peacekeeping operation.
Huh.
So I think last year, DR Congo government finally decided, and I don't entirely even know why, because again, Kinshasa is kind of a third wheel in the conflict on its own territory here. But maybe for politics, maybe for political reasons, since there was an election in DR Congo last year, the government actually asked the UN to leave. Before they had been invited, because the government obviously needed help trying to suppress the fighting, but the deployment has become politically toxic and controversial enough that the government saw it as beneficial to ask the UN to leave, and they have done so. I think it had been like a 25-year mission, something like that. So it had been one of the longer UN peacekeeping missions, but that is now over. And I think the president, or the guy who became president, who I believe was also the incumbent, made the argument that now that the UN is gone, the Congolese army can actually, fight these militias more earnestly, since they're not handcuffed by all of these, human rights considerations that the United Nations was insisting on trying to enforce. I suspect that's bullshit. I suspect more likely that he doesn't really care. It's kind of a de facto independent region of the Congo at this point. So I suspect the government is just kind of pretending to do something about the problem while actually just taking symbolic actions. An approach to problem solving that has become despairingly common in the United States. So I'm sure you all listening will find it very familiar. Congo is no different in that regard.
Appear to do something useful. Okay, I'm pulling the map of the Congo up. Trisha, thank you for the raid. Welcome. We are discussing the Congo. So you broke down, kind of goes back to Rwanda stuff in the 90s. Let me show this. Okay, so Rwanda is on the far eastern side of the country, just north of Burundi and Tanzania. Yeah. It's got Uganda to the north and the east, and South Sudan is not too far away. So their militias eastern DPRK? No, not that. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Different acronym. So like Mwenga and Butembo, like those areas? The cities on the border?
Yeah, I think North Kivu is one of those. I don't remember which.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's the area in question.
Cool. Yeah, that's a part of the world I know very little about. I think I've watched a documentary on Central African Republic, but I don't know too much about Congo or Rwanda.
So do you see all of the lakes in the region?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's what's called the Great Lakes region of Africa.
Cool.
It encompasses Lake Victoria, which is kind of north of that area, Lake Kivu, which is on the border of Rwanda and Congo, and then what the big one there between Tanzania and Congo, I forget the name. And then south of that is Lake Malawi. So there's a whole gaggle of big lakes there, and that region is called the Great Lakes region on account of it. And it's very densely populated, which is the significance of the lakes. The access to the lakes and to seafood, as well as to the fertility of the land in the region, means that agriculture is fairly productive. And the result has been that historically the population in the Great Lakes region has been much more dense than in other parts of Africa. Looking at the Congo, you can see the rainforest there, which is a huge stretch of territory. Much more difficult to build up large population density there, for obvious reasons. And then the areas to the southwest of the Great Lakes region are generally more semi-arid in nature, which has also limited the ability of dense populations to emerge. And of course, to the north is sort of the Sahel and then the Sahara, which is very arid. So, the Great Lakes was probably one of, if not the main population center of sub-Saharan Africa, saving only for the Ethiopian Plateau and West Africa.
Yeah, Nigeria.
Yeah. Those would be the other two.
Cool. Man, I don't know shit about this region.
Of course, there's all of the violence in the Congo, but other than that, it's relatively quiet. And actually, a number of governments in the Great Lakes region are doing relatively well for themselves. Kenya is probably the standout. They've got decent economic growth and relatively robust political institutions. In an election year, not so much, but outside of an election year, they do better. Tanzania, for its part, has done pretty well. They've kept things pretty stable. And, their attitude has been one of non-alignment. They don't really have a dramatic foreign policy where they're kind of getting entangled and stuff, either in Africa or outside of Africa. They try to keep to themselves. And, results have been mixed, but overall they've done a pretty decent job of building their economy, building institutions, etc. So Kenya and Tanzania are some of the standout performers as far as sub-Saharan African countries and economic growth and development go. Rwanda has actually been a big standout economically. In fact, Rwanda's economy has grown even more than Kenya's. The only criticism there is that politically they're a little more lagging. The political institutions in Rwanda are very authoritarian. The president is a guy named Paul Kagame. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's ruled the country basically as his personal fiefdom for something like 20 years or so. And normally that would be grounds for a lot of human rights human rights violations, accusations, trouble with international organizations, things like that. But as is, Rwanda has performed well enough economically over time, and behaved itself relatively well since the mass genocide in the mid-90s, that a lot of international institutions have been willing to look the other way and just kind of accept that, Kagame may not be perfect, but he's doing a pretty good job overall in terms of improving conditions and economic opportunities in the region. Well, in Rwanda specifically, if not also the region. So his indiscretions in Eastern Congo tend to be overlooked for that reason. So Rwanda has done very well. It's actually recovered very strongly from the genocide. Burundi is probably the underperformer in the group as far as Great Lakes nations. They haven't done nearly as well, and there's been just intermittent political unrest of one kind or another over the past several years. That's about all the reporting I've seen on Burundi.
What are they restless about? Just poor conditions, not opportunity?
Authoritarian government, autocratic leaders trying to suppress dissent, the usual authoritarian rigmarole.
Gotcha.
It kind of plays out the same regardless of country. So Burundi is no different in that regard. All of them, as a side note here, are a part of a supranational institution called IGAD, which stands for Intergovernmental something development. I forget exactly. Let me look it up. Intergovernmental Authority on Development. There you go. So that's a regional institution that's designed to bring the countries in the region together in order to build a single market and eventually have a single parliament, kind of like the European Parliament, that can vote on issues of common interest. And, that may sound a little pie in the sky, but it's actually probably the most developed such institution in Africa. Obviously, there's others, but, the one in Southern Africa is a dead letter. Nothing's been done with that for like decades, so that's not even worth mentioning. There is one in Central Africa that was attempted, but I don't think that even made it much beyond the planning stage. It exists more on paper than it does in reality, in other words. In West Africa, they have ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. They were doing pretty well, and they had much the same vision for how they would develop their institution over time, but the recent spat of military coups among member states has upset the status quo a bit, to the point where ECOWAS is becoming weaker, and it's kind of not clear how relevant it's going to be able to be in the future. There were a couple of member states of ECOWAS that actually withdrew from it, I think today or yesterday. So that obviously that's a problem for any supranational institution that has any kind of ambition to bring states together. If states are leaving, then that plan is not going well. So we'll see what happens. It could just be posturing, and so they may be brought back into the fold, sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. ECOWAS makes a lot of sense, just in terms of the economic benefits it brings. Having everybody in a single market is very much necessary for economic development in Africa. The countries of Africa are just too small to be self-sufficient. So invariably, they're going to have to trade with other countries. And it's better to allow trade with your neighbors, because you're going to get a lot more economic growth out of that than you will just trading with countries on the other side of an ocean. Intercontinental trade of one kind or another, that could be a significant generator of growth. But as far as low-level economic growth that benefits local communities, like cross-border trade, pretty much trumps everything else. So, that is useful and necessary for them. But, leaving ECOWAS is going to make that worse, not better. So, I'm not optimistic about conditions in West Africa for the foreseeable future correspondingly, for that and a number of other reasons. But IGAD, in contrast, is doing pretty well. They've been expanding membership. I think they got South Sudan in recently, although it's debatable how big a pickup that is, given how South Sudan is these days. But they are expanding, and they are trying to develop the power of their supranational parliament. So, overall, it's going well. It's just going a little slower than I'm sure they would like on account of all the drama in the Horn of Africa. I think they even instituted Somalia in the past year or so, if I remember correctly. I don't know why they did, since Somalia's government largely exists only on paper, but apparently they thought it was a decent investment in the future. Presumably Somalia is not going to be a chaotic mess forever, hopefully. So if that is the case, being on good terms with the government and trying to get them to integrate into your new burgeoning regional trading bloc does make some sense in that regard. So maybe that's what they have in mind. So long story short, keep an eye on IGAD. That could be a regional power, or at least regionally significant, within the next 10 years, if things continue to go as they have been, with decent economic growth and relatively decent governance for the region.
How's Djibouti doing?
It exists.
People love hearing about Djibouti.
Not much changes in Djibouti because they have an autocratic government that has had the same president in power for, decades? What is this? I don't even remember his name. I don't even really think of him that much. Djibouti really stays out of the news for the most part. They're not around. They don't really get involved in a lot of shenanigans. The only reason I think people started paying attention to them at all is because of the anti-piracy missions that started up over the course of the 2010s. There was a big upsurge in international piracy based out of Somalia and other areas in the region. And so there was a big international effort to coordinate a naval response to that. And Djibouti ended up playing host to most of those anti-piracy missions, which came from a host of different countries, up to and including China. The base that China had and that set up in Djibouti was, I think, their first major overseas base of substance. So that kind of got people chattering about it. So people have been kind of focusing a little more on Djibouti. But, the reality is that the Djibouti government makes a lot of money off of those naval deployments, and so has no incentive to kind of rock the boat. Mm-hmm. Like if they firmly align with China against the United States, they're going to lose a bunch of investment. They're going to lose a bunch of business that comes from hosting their military bases. And then vice versa. Obviously, if they turn on China, they lose China's base as well. So, given how lucrative those bases and the fees that the countries who run them pay to the Djibouti government are, the Djibouti government just doesn't do anything. They don't have a big military buildup. They don't engage in really ambitious regional plans or schemes. Largely the government there just collects its money from all these different governments and then spends it on itself. And when I say itself, I don't mean the country. I mean just the patronage network of the president in question. And so the president of Djibouti is Ismail Omar Guelleh. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that, so I apologize. But he's been in power since 1999. So it's coming up on the quarter century mark for him. Yeah, he's the president, but really he's Djibouti's business owner. He owns Djibouti and he makes money off of it. That's how autocrats work in most developing countries. So he has no incentive to do anything dramatic as foreign policy wise. So there's nothing to report on Djibouti that I know about.
Okay. I was mainly starting out as a butt joke, but I appreciate the report nonetheless. Djibouti.
My Djibouti is fine. It's just suffering from a lack of attention, you might say.
What? Do you want someone to smack your butt?
Living that single life.
Oh, gotcha. Well, I wish you good fortune, should you choose to seek out a person. That's my one too. Chat agrees with you. It's a worthwhile goal.
You remember that Mexican restaurant that served you the roach nachos?
Yeah, in Oak Cliff.
Yeah, I still go to that. That's been an old family favorite for a long time. Went there recently. Very good. It's unfortunate you had a bad experience. It's worth going back if you ever have time.
Yeah, we actually got invited because of my viola instructor was a mariachi performer as one of his gigs, and they had a performance there, so it's like a pretty regular spot where they would go, which is usually a good sign because oftentimes if they have authentic music, they have authentic food. And it's also kind of it feels good when you're hiring local musicians to perform like that. I don't know, I always liked mariachi performers. The thing that was really impressive about my instructor was his vocal power. Like his ability to sing really loud and fully was pretty impressive. He wasn't a super tall dude, pretty broad, but impressive nonetheless.
Yeah, there's a lot of mariachi music here in Dallas. Well, there used to be. I don't drive very much anymore, but when I did, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, like I would regularly hear mariachi music just kind of driving around. They tend to play it pretty loud.
Yes, definitely.
Which I think is how you're supposed to play it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I did notice it kind of became less frequent over time. You know, I think it's something that is more popular with the first-gen immigrants.
Yeah, true.
Generally from Mexico.
Second-generation immigrants were going for Daddy Yankee Gasolina.
Yeah. Yeah, they have somewhat different tastes. Well, is there any other variety of human suffering we wanted to get to?
We might have the questions from last week that we never got to, because last week, for people who want to check out the VOD, was basically 100% history. We didn't even talk about news. So if you like just random history stuff, that's a pretty good one for us. Talking about the early formations of the colonies in the United States, or what would later become the United States and Canada. Really interesting book. It's called American Nations. I would highly recommend it. But we talked about that pretty much the entire time. And then we talked about other colonial efforts, and we were kind of breaking down just the different stages of when Europe decided to colonize the New World and Africa and Asia and India and stuff like that. And I didn't know a lot about especially colonization efforts in India and Asia and how they were later than the ones to the New World. So check out that VOD if you want. But I think we got a bunch of questions and we just went to none of them because we talked history the whole time.
Gotcha. Yeah, so let's see. I work in the service, hospitality, and food service. Over the last 2 years, I've been laid off twice and noticed multiple companies going bankrupt or bare bones. I believe this is due to the population not having spare income to enjoy services, but do you think this will continue? Or is it a different factor? This is definitely a mostly personal question, but I would enjoy your input. Do you think the way the U.S. economy is going will see a decline in the services sector, hospitality, tourism, food services, etc.? And that's from Sammy Theth?
Sammy Theth, yeah. It's kind of a tongue twister.
Actually, in terms of employment data, the sector you're talking about, the hospitality sector, I don't know if this person is even listening right now. I'm going to answer the question as though they were, but just for my own convenience. Yeah, the hospitality sector, in terms of employment data, has actually been a star performer over the past couple years. The job growth in the hospitality sector has frequently been among the strongest, if not the strongest, among different various economic sectors. So I'm not sure why you've worked for, I don't know why you've had trouble or why the places in your area have been having trouble, but in general, at the aggregate national level, the hospitality sector is doing pretty good. Just by looking at, according to the data, it's been doing pretty good. It could be that there's regional variance there. So it could be that the geographic area that you're in is not enjoying as much tourism or has not enjoyed a revival so much in things like restaurant activity and other sorts of things associated with the hospitality sector. That's a possibility. Yeah, I'm not sure why your area has those kinds of problems. If I had to guess, I would guess that everywhere is doing pretty good, give or take, some regional variance. It could be that you're working in specific industries within the hospitality sector that have not been doing as well. Things like restaurants, food service, what have you, they've been doing well. I'm not as sure about tourism. I don't remember hearing tourism numbers recently. And it may be that a lot of people are preferring to stay home, given that, there was a lot of revenge travel after the pandemic, sort of 21, 22. That's what they called it at the time.
That's so funny.
But I think it's kind of died down since then. So it could be that tourism has been somewhat on the decline, but other aspects of the hospitality sector have been pretty strong. So I'm not sure what the issue would be there.
Because you put us in quarantine for so long, we're going to travel extra far just because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, they actually called it the same thing in China. Revenge travel, what have you. Common phenomena, it seems. But I don't think that people don't have money to spend on services. They very much do. The services sector is the leading economic driver in the United States, much more so than manufacturing or agriculture. And, that's a pretty broad statement. The services sector is huge. It encompasses a whole variety of different industries, many of which have virtually nothing in common. I think services is like, 70% of the economy at this point? Probably more by now. I don't think manufacturing has been growing much. So, yeah, services is a main economic driver, and in so much as the U.S. economy has been exceeding expectations over the past couple years in terms of performance, it's largely been because of services sector's industries doing well. So, people definitely have money to spend on services. That's actually specifically the reason the U.S. economy has been as robust as it has been.
Cool.
So to answer the question, no, I don't think there's going to be a decline in the services sector. It seems to be pretty robust, and the structural factors undergirding that continued robustness don't seem set to change. Although I have to add an asterisk to that, because whenever it comes to forecasting economic performance, currently, whenever it comes to forecasting economic performance right now, as well as just at any time in the past couple of years, you always have to kind of note that there's an immense amount of uncertainty. We have a lot of unprecedented shit happening all at the same time, affecting both the U.S. economy and the global economy. And our ability as economists to forecast how that plays out in practice, in the data, over the course of the short to medium to long term is very low. Like, very few people have any real confidence in their ability to forecast economic performance at this point. This past year was a case in point, because if you remember, we talked at the beginning of 2023 about how over the course of the preceding couple years, every expectation about how a given year would play out ended up being wrong. Right? 2019, there was an international economic slowdown. That was the thing that a lot of people watching markets were talking about. So it was expected that there would be a mild international recession in 2020, which was wrong. We did not have a mild recession in 2020. We had a gigantic pandemic-induced depression, albeit a short-term one, that year. So at the end of 2020, during which time there was a pretty robust economic recovery, it was expected that there would be economic recovery in 2021 without significant inflation. And so what did we get? Significant inflation. So that was wrong. That prediction was wrong. So at the end of 2021, We have all of this inflation. The government has risen, has tried to, has increased interest rates. I should say the Fed has increased interest rates. So, the prediction for 2022 is that the inflation would be transitory and that it would eventually slow down. And then things would moderate as rates had an effect. And not transitory. It was not transitory. And it turned into a big issue. So, 2023, what's going to happen, right? The economy is slowing down. The interest rates are having an effect. So the expectation, the hope was that there would be a soft landing. But by that point, everybody just expected, okay, there's going to be a recession this time, right? Inflation is taking its toll. Having high interest rates with high inflation is like a recipe for clear-cut declines in production and employment. So surely in 2023, we're going to have at least a mild recession. There's no way the Fed is going to be able to nail the soft landing because there's virtually no other examples where a central bank institution has been able to nail that. Especially given all of especially given the unprecedented nature of all of the inflation and economic discord that was happening in 2022. There was very little, hope that the Fed would be able to manage it. And then what do we get in 2023? Soft landing. It actually happened. Like they actually managed to get through the year without the economy imploding. There wasn't even a mild recession. The economy just kind of had mild normal growth for almost the entire year, during which time inflation continued to go down slowly, but it went down. So for once, everything went according to plan, which means that the prediction again for 2023 was wrong. So everybody's always wrong. That's the takeaway. Nobody knows what the fuck is happening or why. So when you talk to economists and get their feedback on, what the forecast is for the upcoming year, keep that in mind. And they know that. All economists know that we're struggling right now to make any kind of sense out of this absolute clusterfuck of a global economy. So what's going to happen in 2024? I have no fucking idea. Nobody knows. Ideally, continued moderate growth and continued disinflation, but who knows? War, pandemic, comet, could be anything. I don't know. I'm not particularly optimistic about it, but given that things did go according to plan last year and that a lot of leading indicators are moderating, not all in positive directions, there is some indication that American consumers are kind of finally coming under pressure. The jobs market is starting to slow a little bit, starting to cool off. Not so much in terms of employment numbers, which continue to be bizarrely strong, but more so in terms of people switching jobs. It was noted late last year that the number of people leaving jobs to get higher paying jobs was happening at a lower incidence, which suggests that that demand for new hires has been moderating over the course of the past year. So that's an early indicator that the labor market might be cooling off. And so between that and the debt load on consumers, which seems to be kind of coming to a head, we'll see, that suggests that consumption should flatten this year or start to decline, in which case there would be a decline in economic performance. How mild it would be, who the fuck knows, but nominally that's the outlook. But again, there's so many other variables that it's almost pointless to even try. Who knows? Energy could fluctuate wildly depending on the Middle East or Ukraine. If China's economy takes off again, that's going to put huge inflationary pressure on the global economy. That's invariably going to show up in the US, especially in terms of gasoline prices, which of course makes everybody crazy here, which is going to have big knock-on political effects. Lots of different things could happen. Housing has started to recover. But that also means that housing prices and probably rents will start going up again too, which is going to make people crazy because that was one of the main drivers of inflation over the past couple years. So that's also is a big risk factor. So lots of drama there in the economic field. There's a lot to keep your eye on, for sure. How did I even get on to, what were we talking about?
It was a question about the economy, and you were talking through each year and why it was weird.
Yeah. I don't even remember why. My brain is so shit these days. Well, that's where the U.S. economy is for anyone who was curious. I'm hoping against hope that was relevant to the original question. John Smith is getting old, folks. My apologies. I beg your patience.
All good.
Well, let's see. Next question. Agent Smith, what do you think the end result will be with Israel in the ICJ proceedings? Yeah, this question kind of timed out because the ICJ proceedings did not end, but they did issue a ruling, which was that Israel did not have to end operations. The ICJ did recognize Israel had a right to defend itself and to retaliate against Hamas because of the October attack. However, they also added that they did not think that Israel was adhering to various rules of war, and that they were committing basically, war crimes, and that they should, stop doing that. To which the Israeli government was very upset. So, predictably, the fallout from this ruling is going to be nothing, because the Israeli government doesn't want to deviate from their current path. And I don't know that there's much that can cause them to deviate from the current path. So that being the case, the ICJ ruling, like a lot of such rulings, will probably end up being mostly ignored. Now, the case is ongoing, so there's going to be further judgments going forward, but for now, that's what they've released thus far. That was sort of an early issue by the court. That is to say, an early ruling by the court. So not a lot of excitement there. Okay, we had some questions today. Have we had a world discussion since Kissinger's passing? Would like to get your take on his life legacy. Honestly, I guess I have two things to say about Kissinger. One, he was a really smart guy. Obviously did some nasty things, but, if you're looking for ethics in foreign policy, certainly in Washington of all places, you might as well look for chastity in a brothel. You're really looking in the wrong place. So, yes, terrible things were done, but if you are going to do terrible things as a realist, as many people in Washington are, Kissinger did it in a relatively smart way. So credit where credit is due there. He also did a lot of commentary on foreign relations and international relations, and a lot of that was pretty decent. I actually have a book that he wrote maybe like 20 years ago that I read in high school. That was kind of an early introduction to just sort of a range of global international issues of one sort or another at that time. And, his analysis, I didn't always agree with his analysis, but, I always did think that he had good arguments and that he had a good foundation for his arguments. So, smart guy. So that's the first thing I would have to say about it. The other thing I would say is that he's a bit overrated. And, there's kind of, I guess you could further break that statement down into he's overrated in two separate, distinct ways. One, in the field of realism, he's a bit overrated because he didn't really accomplish all that much. Like, he was in office for a while. He participated in the rapprochement between China and the United States. That was obviously a big deal. He engaged in a lot of activity in Latin America, famously so. I'm sure we have some people from Latin America listening who have some colorful things to say about Kissinger. He was very active during the time when he was in office, but he wasn't in office all that long. And the stuff that he did had pretty mixed results. Like, as far as rapprochement with China, yeah, that's a pretty big move. That was a big deal. He was not exclusively responsible for it, but in so much as he was a participant, yeah, fine, I give him credit for that. Latin America, though, much shakier ground. Like, did you really need Operation Phoenix? No, not Phoenix. Condor. Did you really need Operation Condor? Probably not. The situation in the region at the time was probably not significantly dire enough to really justify that. And, I kind of get it. Communists were performing a lot of violence in cities as urban guerrillas at the time in Latin America. So, fine, do something. But whether you need to really extend the degree of support that was extended to authoritarian regimes in the region, and whether that had any kind of significant effect on outcomes, is highly debatable. So in that sense, pretty debatable. I don't know that he really deserves credit for significantly boosting American foreign policy. Well, I don't know that he deserves credit for significantly boosting American national interests abroad over the course of the 1970s. China, full credit. Everything else, kind of more of a mixed bag. Shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, like, okay, fine. But is that something that Kissinger alone had to do, could have done? Or is that something that pretty much anybody who was Secretary of State at the given time could have done? So debatable there as well. So from a realist perspective, it's kind of debatable to me that he was as impactful as he's sometimes remembered. There's also another criticism I would make, which is that the flip side of not being as impactful is that he was not as evil as people made him out to be after the fact either. I think people point to the bombing of Laos, like that was something he did. Like Henry Kissinger ordered the bombing of Laos. No, he didn't. That was largely a military decision. And it was not really a controversial one because, yeah, of course, the Vietnam War extended into Laos and Cambodia. Like, that was not controversial. Like, the whole Vietnam War was very controversial. We've talked about that a little bit last time. But the idea that the United States would, engage in military activity in bordering countries in which the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong were active and present should not be that controversial, especially given that the Laotian government was pretty okay with it. They actually condoned it, given that they were in a kind of de facto war of their own against Laotian communists who were allied with Vietnamese communists. So, the idea that Henry Kissinger is responsible for all of the destruction that was wrought by the bombing of Laos, I don't really buy that. I don't really buy that as a substantive criticism. Condor, yes, but much more criticism to be had there, but not so much Laos. So yeah, an important historical figure, but not this sort of all-star either. I don't think he's going to go down in American history as one of like the great American diplomats.
I think it is weird though that he lived so long, and that's why a lot of people think he's a lich. But he just quietly lives on to be like 100+ years old or something.
Well, he was living off of the negative energy from Noam Chomsky. all of that hate and dislike, just was converted into life energy that propelled Henry Kissinger well past his due date.
It's funny.
So now that he's gone, I don't know what Noam Chomsky will do. All that negative energy presumably will now consume him because it doesn't have an outlet anymore.
We need a wizard expert to let us know what the outcome of that is.
Let's see. I've heard that the method of measuring inflation was altered in some fundamental way circa 1980 and again in 2020. If this is true, why was it done? How have inflation and CPI metrics changed throughout the years? That's a very technical question that I should know more about. Yeah, there was a change in 2020. I don't remember. I remember going out of my way to read about it and learn it at the time, but it hasn't come up since then for several years. So my memory is not entirely up to snuff. Actually, maybe it's not inflation I was thinking of. I don't remember. It's been too long. Yeah, you're right that there was a change in 2020, but I'm struggling to remember what it was. Actually, I might be thinking more about that, because there was a change in how No, that's what it was. Money supply. They changed how money supply was calculated around 2020. So yeah, okay. So then the answer is I don't know for sure, because I was thinking of money supply. Yeah, it has changed over the years, but I don't remember like what specific changes were made in given years. From what I do know about how CPI has changed over time, generally it's just a change in the composition of the basket of goods that is used to calculate the number. For those of you who maybe don't know what the consumer price index is, the consumer price index is a estimation. Well, it's an index, I should say. Obviously, it's an index that is used to estimate inflation based off of a given selection of the most common goods that influence how much people pay month to month. So, your milk, your gas bill, your rent, whatever, all of that stuff is sort of your basic month to month. All of that stuff comprises most of your month to month expenses. And so if you want to calculate inflation, one way to do that is just to estimate what the average basket of goods that everybody is consuming is, and then look at the price change in those goods over time, and then average that change out into a single headline inflation number. So the consumer price index is the main number that is used for that purpose, that is generated from that methodology. There's actually different ways to generate inflation number depending on methodology, and a lot of the differences in methodology come down to differences in how you construct the basket of goods. So CPI is the most all-encompassing. It just kind of throws in everything. But there's others that actually exclude certain items. For example, the PCE is an alternative to the CPI. And the basket of goods that's used to produce the PCE inflation number actually excludes food and energy costs. And when I say energy costs, I mean just fuel for your car. Like the money you spend fueling your car is mostly what that refers to. So, food and gas are excluded from the PCE number. And the reason they're excluded is because those are really volatile numbers. Food and gas are so volatile that the Fed doesn't really care that much about them. They are important determinants of overall inflation. But the trouble is that they change so much that the Fed doesn't really care. Like their main focus is core inflation, which is inflation that is generally driven not by supply factors or even necessarily demand factors, but rather expectations. Because the big fear of every central bank is that inflation will become self-propagating. That is to say, people will increase prices not because of either supply or demand, but just because they expect prices to continue to increase. And so that can lead to a hyperinflationary cycle, a hyperinflationary reciprocating cycle of price increases, which nobody wants. That's very bad economically for everybody. So that being the case, a lot of central banks prefer inflation numbers that are calculated from less volatile areas. Because, it would be easy to see a big spike in food or gas price and then say, oh my God, prices are going up. Maybe there's going to be hyperinflation soon. Well, no, probably there's just been some kind of supply side shock to gasoline from, just another bout of violence in the Middle East, or maybe some country confiscated oil industry assets, or, who knows, whatever random thing is happening in oil markets in a given year. That could just be a temporary factor that goes away, like in a month or two. So in that case, you have to be careful about how you interpret spikes in inflation. You have to figure out what's driving the inflation. And so what the Fed has decided is that it's much better to just filter out the random noise from food and gas and just focus on the core stuff. So, that's the logic behind the PCE. And then there's other compositions of the basket of goods that exclude things like rent and other such costs, like medical costs. The idea there being that they want to focus exclusively on baseline consumer goods, just to keep track of those, since those are sometimes thought to be a better indicator of inflation expectations. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. As far as how those methodologies, as far as specific examples of how those methodologies have changed over time, I'd have to look into it. I would really have to go and actually look it up, because I really don't remember like what specific things have changed. I know that there's some organic change that just happens because new products enter the market over time and become, quote unquote, essentials. Like in 1980, nobody had smartphones, so you would not really incorporate that into the calculation for, PCI or sorry, CPI or PCE that you were estimating in 1980. Whereas now you would. So, there is change in that regard. But beyond that, like, I'm not sure like what super wonky technical changes have been made over time. And I would point out that it is important to know those changes. Somebody who actually works in the industry looking at inflation or doing analysis for think tanks would actually know that, because that would be something that they would see in the data. What happens is when you change the way that a given statistic is estimated, generally there's a big change from time period to time period. You'll see like a clear demarcation point. For example, what I was thinking of earlier was a change in how money supply was calculated. And so you can see before the change, there was kind of a pretty steady increase that had a relatively homogeneous rate of change over time that stretched back like 10, 20 years. And then after they made the change, money supply suddenly just shoots up like a straight line. Maybe some of you remember, like a lot of people at the time, talking about how the Fed was printing so much money in order to try to deal with the pandemic, that it was creating inflation, and that this was one of the main drivers of inflation. And, there was some merit to that argument, but one of the data points they cited was this dramatic increase in money supply, which you could, again, very clearly see in the data at that time. What they were not telling you is that the main reason for that dramatic increase was actually just a change in the way the data was estimated. They literally just broadened the definition to encompass more things, and by doing so, the overall headline number went up. And it looked on paper like a big dramatic increase, but it was purely an administrative increase. Like, it was purely just down to how the number was estimated. So there's almost certainly been similar examples in the history of inflation data in the United States, where they change they change the methodology of how the number is calculated, or what statistic they use, or what have you. And correspondingly, then you can probably almost invariably see dramatic changes after, the before and after the rule change, the methodology change in the data, that a lot of people probably not in the know misascribed to something else, when really it was just purely academic sort of technical wonky changes of one kind or another for one reason or another.
Wonky
I hope
changes.
you guys are enjoying listening to me mumble through these answers.
I'm chilling.
I'm trying my best. So yeah, that's not a very satisfying answer, but that's the best I can do. If you like, I can try to return to it next time after I've actually looked into it. Because you're right that it has happened. I just don't know the details off the top of my head. Actually, we can just do CPI, since that's what was they were asking about. So let's see. And then the next question was, what's the deal with China's economy? I recently read their stock market is falling and traders are investing in banned cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency never really went away in China. It was definitely heavily regulated. But if there's one consistent factor about China throughout history, it's that people have a somewhat mercenary, subjective approach to whether or not they obey the law or not. So yeah, what's the deal with China's economy? That is a
shadow
very
banks.
Big... Yeah, shadow banks actually continues to be a main feature. That kind of stemmed out from the lack of evolution in the financial sector. China's economy got big before it got sophisticated. And the result is that some of the more complex aspects that are common in large economies, like a mature functioning financial sector, did not emerge in China, or at least have not emerged yet. And the result is that you had the savings of a modern country, which are quite large, like in the trillions of dollars, but no functional modern mechanism through which to channel all of those trillions of dollars of savings. And so the result is, unsurprisingly, a lot of inefficiency A huge amount of money gets spent on stuff like specifically real estate that doesn't really return all that much value. You do get a decent return on investment, but what you're not getting is an actual self-sustaining business that is continuing to produce value and that can give you a return over time. Real estate only gives you a return over time in so much as its value continues to go up, and invariably it will eventually go down. So investing in an actual, ongoing business concern is generally the preferable outcome. And that's what the Chinese government wants. They want people investing in businesses. They want more jobs, more production, more self-sufficiency, et cetera. But people are just putting their money in real estate instead because that has a higher return. And the government is its own worst enemy as far as changing that, because the government heavily incentivizes, effectively, investment in the real estate sector, both by way of tacit industrial policy, because they dump money on the economy whenever it suffers a downturn in order to generate employment. So invariably that ends up in construction, the real estate market, and then that just reinforces the pre-existing bias of investment money towards real estate. But even beyond that, there's an inherent structural bias in favor of real estate because that's how a lot of local governments in China raise money. In fact, it's basically how all of them raise money. A lot of locally raised tax revenue is not held by local governments. Instead, it's passed on to the national government, whereupon money is then redistributed back to localities. However, the government does not like sharing that money. So the result is that local governments are very frequently pressed for cash, which is a problem because the national government issues policy dictates all of the time. There's always some new thing, new policy, new national program that the national government wants local and provincial governments to help them implement. So you have a responsibility to implement some kind of policy, maybe it's self-sufficiency, maybe something relating to industrial policy, maybe something to reducing poverty. Like there's always just some damn thing coming out of Beijing telling all these other governments, subnational government entities in China, what to do. So they have to deliver on that, but they don't have the money to do it with. So the result then is they sell land, specifically to real estate developers. And so that means that the government's ability to prosecute and provide government services of one kind or another and pursue government objectives, specifically with regard to industrial policy, is largely, is partly, if not largely, contingent on the ability of these local governments to continue raising money through the real estate market. Because without that, there would be less policy provision. These local governments play an important role in terms of industrial policy. That might sound surprising to people. You might think that the national government does all of the industrial policy stuff, and then local governments and provincial governments just do peripheral, local type stuff. That's not true. That is not how governance in China works. China's government is kind of weird and wonky. It was designed by revolutionaries, and it's got a lot of kind of goofy, very optimistic type structures to it that don't actually work in practice. And one of those is this idea that a large country of 1 billion people can have a centralized form of government. That's never really worked throughout history, and China's no exception. But what China tries to do, because it does have this centralized form of government, is it tries to distribute responsibility for governing amongst all of its various government entities. So instead of having just a clear demarcation between responsibilities of entities, rather all of them have the same responsibilities. So if the party wants to reduce poverty, then it'll declare, say, a program of quote unquote common prosperity. That was an actual thing they did a couple of years ago. The tagline was common prosperity, and they went out and tried to implement a bunch of poverty reduction schemes. But rather than having a single national government program to do that, the party released a memo basically saying that all party officials at all levels of government should be doing something to reduce poverty. And so not only the national government, but also provincial local governments all started doing that. So kind of a not insignificant replication of labor there. This was not really coordinated. One of the problems that China has in terms of its governance is that there's not actually very good cooperation between different levels of government. Partly it's just because the Chinese government is so big. It's a huge country, and government in turn is very big, and it's going to be big in a communist country anyway, even if it's only technically communist, quote unquote. Even so, government is very large, and in a large country, that just scales up immensely. So that just makes the process very, very complicated. But it's even more complicated in China, just because the history of governance in China has always been one of local officials just kind of doing whatever they want, getting away with whatever they can. And given the lack of oversight, that generally amounted to quite a bit. So China now is kind of better in that regard than it used to be, but there's still an immense amount of discretion owing to lack of oversight that is de facto granted to localities and provincial governments. So, again, to bring this full circle, I'm just illustrating here that local governments and provincial governments are important to the pursuit of industrial policy, the pursuit of pretty much any other major political objective or policy that is proposed in China. All of that is done at the party level, and the party just tells everybody to do it at the same time. It's not a very sophisticated approach. The party has done good policy before. I've read that in general, policy is relatively smart, but they're trying to implement smart policy through a very flawed government institution, or more accurately, through a whole series of flawed government institutions at all levels of Chinese society. So results correspondingly have been pretty mixed. But regardless, that's why it's important that localities be able to continue to sell land in the real estate market. They need that money to continue to provide public services and pursue party objectives. If they ever can't do that, then the government will be on a more stable financial footing, and it'll discourage the real estate bubble in China, or more accurately, real estate bubble, since it's not really a single unified real estate market. That's a whole other topic of conversation. It'll have some positive effects, but overall the effect would probably be negative, because there would be a significant curtailment in provision of public services at a local level, but also in terms of industrial policy, which is very, very important to the Chinese government. So in that sense, it's actually kind of caught in a Gordian knot. I said last year that I was going to have a big talk about the Chinese economy, and we never got to it. But the main conclusion that I reached in that, I'm going to give you like the shortest of short versions of this. The short version of this is that there are three legs to the Chinese economy right now. Well, there are three main issues, maybe I should say. One is the real estate bubble. One is local government debt. And then the third one, what's the third one? You'd think I would remember after all this time. I've read about it enough times. Public provision, that's what it was. Public provision of government services and industrial policy. I'm just going to call it government services here. Right, so real estate, local government debt, government services. These three things are all interconnected. And the Chinese government, the Gordian knot that the Chinese government faces is that it can't change any one of them without automatically changing the other two. So you don't like the real estate bubble? Okay, well, we can discourage investment in the real estate sector, which is what they did in 2021. But the result of that is that local governments have to take on more debt because they had been raising money through the real estate market. Now they can't, so they have to borrow more. So now you have a debt problem at the local level. Also, you're going to have less provision of government services, most likely, unless the local governments borrow a whole shit ton of money in order to make up the difference, in which case maybe it's the same. If you don't like local government debt, you can cut it back, but that means they have to sell more land to make up the revenue difference. If you want more government services, if you want more money going into your industrial policy, well, invariably that's going to mean more government spending, and that means either more local government debt or more sales of real estate, which is going to make which either is going to make the real estate bubble worse or the local government debt problem worse. So this is where they're at. This is what the Chinese government, more specifically the CPC, is really struggling with. They want to reflate the real estate bubble because that became, the real estate sector was just so important to the overall economy that you really can't have a substantive economic recovery at this point in China without the real estate market. And the government is sufficiently concerned about the underperformance of China's economy last year that they're willing to resurrect, bring back the real estate bubble if it means that they can have better economic performance. So that's a trade-off that they're willing to make. That's going to have dire consequences in the long term, but that's just where they're at. They want to deal with the problem now, and so they're going to try to do it with the real estate market. So that'll relieve somewhat the debt problem, which is not as bad as people kind of make it out to be, by the way. But we could talk about that if somebody wants to. But for now, the debt problem is not that bad, and it's going to stay that way if the real estate market does kind of come back into a boom status, because that'll give a lot of money to local governments to provide services. But of course, that brings them back to the problem that they'd originally had, which is that housing is increasingly unaffordable, and that's a problem for the government's legitimacy, because a lot of people are struggling to find jobs, or when they do find jobs, they're not necessarily well-paying jobs. There's a lot of underemployment in China right now, where a lot of college graduates are having to settle for employment that is kind of beneath their ability and potential. And that's a really good way to upset people. In general, I think, who was it? What's his name? That Slovenian
Zizek,
guy. Yeah, made the point that, revolutions are not about, violence or starvation. They're about people's expectations being disappointed. That's when people really get upset. Even if their conditions are relatively good, if they're sufficiently disappointed as far as their expectations, that is grounds for some political discord, potentially even revolution. So, in general, there had been an upsurge in Chinese nationalism and Chinese pride over much of the past 10 years. But now with the latest generation, the latest cohort, you might say, of young people, that's starting to change. There is a lot of disenchantment right now amongst younger folks, and that's starting to spread a bit. So the government does kind of feel that pressure. It's not too bad right now, but the government does feel it needs to be proactive about it. So invariably, that means more government services, which invariably means, invariably that means the real estate bubble is going to get worse. Well, invariably means the government needs to deal with the real estate bubble. And that's probably going to mean more government activity of some kind, which means more spending, which means either the real estate bubble gets worse, which defeats the whole purpose, or more government debt, which turns into a bubble of its own that the government won't be able to substantively deal with. Without some kind of long-term stagnation or other sort of debt-related type crisis. So I guess I'm kind of struggling to describe this, but there's three interrelated factors. To kind of sum this up, there's three interrelated factors, and the government needs to deal with all of them, but it can't without making one of the others worse somehow. And the government now is at a point where it's having to kind of make difficult decisions, trading off one or more of the three against the others. And that's the struggle that the Chinese government has been really wrestling with. They really want to dump a lot of money into industrial policy to be as self-sufficient as possible. But that's all getting funded by either a combination of a real estate bubble and a sort of nascent, burgeoning local debt bubble. And either of those is threatening to the government as far as, either legitimacy or the health of the underlying financial sector. And so they can either deal with that and have a short-term problem with industrial policy and overall economic performance, or they can not deal with the real estate issue and the local debt issue and then have a much bigger economic problem in the long run. And which they're going to go with is not entirely clear. And, the party itself is probably divided on this issue. There's a lot of debate within the party we don't see because, of course, it's, all very insular and authoritarian. But from what little bits and pieces we can gather, there is a debate within the party between people who are more free market oriented and people who are more nostalgic and conservative for a more statist driven economic model. And the statists are kind of in the driver's seat and have been for much of the past 10 years. But a lot of their projects are starting to struggle now. And the free market guys have more and more ammunition after each subsequent year with which to use against the statist crowd. So the weight is starting to shift a little more towards the free market crowd. The government did come out recently in the past couple months and actually starting to address foreign business concerns about the business environment in China. So they are trying to reattract some foreign investment, which is more of a free market thing to do. The statists are a lot more paranoid about foreign investment. So there is some shift in that regard. But whether or not there's going to be a much broader shift back towards the free market governance that more defined the 90s and aughts, That's debatable. Probably not would be my guess, because Xi Jinping is more of the statist mind, and he's pretty thoroughly ensconced himself and his patronage network in power at this point. I don't know that there's a lot of countervailing perspectives that are going to carry a lot of weight. In so much as there's a debate that is for more free market reforms, it's happening at lower levels of the party. And a lot of the policies in that vein tend to happen at the lower level as well, not so much at the national level. So I'm not optimistic about the overall direction and trajectory of the Chinese economy. I don't think it's going to collapse either. I think that there's been some overwrought, prognostications to that effect. But it is kind of entering a period where growth seems to be slowing from year to year, and stagnation seems to be in the cards, which is pretty much what we predicted a couple of years ago when we were talking about this. It seemed more and more like the government was willing to trade away long-term prospects in exchange for short-term solutions to short-term problems. And the trade-off there, the cost over the long term, is going to be slower growth and eventually stagnation, and that, in general, broadly speaking, seems to be where they're headed. Did any of that make any sense?
Yes. Some of it made at least some sense.
Okay.
There's a question in chat about French protests. Farmers apparently are very pissed off, spraying poo on the Capitol.
You sure is he thinking of Germany?
Maybe it's German farmers. I thought it was French government. Yeah, they said French.
Huh. I haven't heard about the French farm protest. There are farmers protesting in Germany right now. Those are quite large. That has to do with esoteric bullshit.
Oh.
Yeah, there was a court ruling in Germany last year that the government could not use COVID relief funds to help pay for subsidies to farmers. And so that created a big hole in the German government's budget, because it didn't want to cut the subsidies, but it could not use the relief funds. And so the result is that they ended up proposing and eventually implementing some cuts to the subsidies to farmers. And that upset a lot of people, because the government, specifically the SPD, had promised that that was exactly what they were not going to do. So results are as you see. Mass protests in Germany against the government, spearheaded by farmers. French farmers, I have no idea. That's a new one on me.
They said it's in the last 24 hours.
Oh, yeah, I don't know shit about it. I'll probably read about it tomorrow, but for now, I don't know about it.
And then
That's news to me.
TRJ and C said Evergrande fell over looks even more likely. It just hit the press, relevant to the Chinese economy topic.
It doesn't really matter. I mean, if Evergrande or one of the other big real estate companies actually goes under, which it won't, then the government would just stop it. But the government wouldn't even allow it to get to that point, because the reality is that the government de facto underwrites those companies. They're effectively guaranteed. I think the free market crowd within the Communist Party has managed to stop the government from just bailing them out completely, because they don't want to set a pattern. They don't want to set a precedent that creates moral hazard, which is that if you're a real estate company, you could just fuck around and borrow and spend money as much as you want, and then when shit hits the fan, then Beijing will just come in and save you. You don't have to worry about using money efficiently. You can create enough of a problem for the overall economy once you get big enough that the government will save you. Lots of people in the party don't want to do that, and I think that is largely the consensus position, even among statists. So the result is that the government has kind of taken a mixed approach to dealing with the big real estate companies that are at the heart of the real estate downturn, which is that they've largely protected foreign investors because they want to encourage them to come in and get money, put money into the sector. I think the Chinese government has it in its head that that could be a way to save these companies without having to spend a bunch of their own money. Basically just get the foreigners to do it. At the same time, they've also somewhat discounted local investors. If you are not a foreign investor in one of these companies, your interests have not quite been as well served. That's not to say that you've been completely ignored, but you can see the government favors foreign investors a bit. And I think it's because they want to try to get more money out of them. But the fact that they're approaching the problem like that, I think explains a lot of the dramatic headlines that you've seen about this, that, or the other company, Countrywide or Evergrande or what have you, experiencing problems. The only reason they're experiencing problems is because the government is trying still to attract foreign investment to bail them out, de facto bail them out. But every time they get close to getting, every time they get close to going bankrupt or reaching some point of no return, invariably the government leans on Chinese banks, a lot of which are state-owned, some of which are not. Regardless, the party just tells them what to do anyway. When the party says you need to lend money to this guy, you pretty much have to do it. You can't really say no. So whenever a critical point is reached in the real estate market vis-a-vis one of these companies, Beijing will order banks to lend them money in order to float them a little bit longer. They don't give them enough money to last for like years on end, because again, they're trying to prevent moral hazard, but they will avoid the worst danger in those cases, and that's how they avoid the worst danger. So I don't think, despite all the headlines, that these companies are in any real, actual danger. The party will always be there to ensure that the companies don't collapse completely, but they are keeping the pressure on the company's leadership to try to find new investors and to try to finish established projects for which there had been a lot of people complaining that they were getting fucked out of their money. That was an important one for the party. But yeah, they're still heaping pressure on the company's leadership to try to deal with these problems on their own as much as is possible. And at the same time, they're also investigating for corruption, of which there's plenty in the real estate market. And so I think that's their leverage. I think sort of the trade-off is you need to find new investors and to float the company yourself. And if you don't, then we're just going to prosecute for the very obvious corruption that we know you've been engaging in for the past, 20 years or however long it's been. Yeah, the Chinese real estate companies are sort of part and parcel of the overall real estate problem in China, which is that it doesn't actually contribute that much to the Chinese economy in terms of like long-term sustainable growth. Real estate prices do return, a return on interest over time, but that's eventually going to end. That's not like a long-term viable investment strategy. So, there is a bubble there that is just draining money out of the productive sectors of the economy, in so much as it takes money out of the financial sector. And dealing with that is a major problem for them, because the more money that goes into the sector, the less that is going into the parts of the economy that are actually going to make China modern, self-sufficient, et cetera. All these other policy objectives that the government has said are important. But they can't just pop it, right? They can't just say you can't lend to the real estate market anymore, because they kind of tried to do something similar to that in 21, and the result is as you see. It's just accelerated the decline in the overall economy and the overall productivity of the economy. So they're going to have to figure something else out, but I don't know what it's going to be, because like I said with the iron triangle I was describing before, they can try to deal with it, but then they're just moving the problem into another area. What they really need is a time machine. The CPC needs a time machine and to go back into the 1990s at the height of the reform period. And they need to talk to, what was his name? Rongji. I forget what his name was. He was like one of the prime administrators responsible for reform at that era. And they need to tell him to focus on financial reform, in addition to all of the other reforms that they were doing. And they needed to do that so that a relatively modern financial sector could have emerged much earlier, preferably at least before 2008. Because, real estate and an inefficient financial sector has been a problem for China for a long time. But the stimulus spending that the Chinese government implemented after the 2008 financial crisis in order to mitigate the crisis and its effects actually greatly exacerbated the problem with an inefficient financial sector and the real estate sector bubble. Because all of that stimulus money, by and large, a lot of it went into real estate. It was not intended for real estate, but effectively that's where it ended up. And so that really skewed the financial system in favor of property. All of these financial companies, all of these shadow banks, everybody who was interested in trying to raise money for investment projects, all of them basically learned how to invest by investing in real estate. And there's just nothing else. Like, there's not really any competing financial force in China that can invest money in a different, more productive way. There are some, but they're nascent, they're small, and a lot of regular rank and file Chinese savers prefer to save their money by investing in real estate. That's just their inherent preference, because they saw that explode not only after the reform period, but especially after the 2008 financial crisis, again, because of the stimulus spending. So there's a structural ingrained behavioral bias among savers and investors in China for real estate that is subsidized and undergirded, at an implicit level by the Chinese government, and especially by local Chinese government. And untangling anything that's behavioral, that relates to expectations or norms, that's invariably difficult. And fixing China's economy right now requires doing that, and the Chinese government has no record of doing that. It's actually pretty bad at it. The Chinese government has said in the past it wants to shift the economy to a consumption-driven economy, kind of away from more of an export/investment-driven economy. And they've largely failed to do that, because changing that requires a shift in mindset away from being a saver towards being a consumer. And most people in China are not really confident enough or feel confident enough in the future of the Chinese economy to really want to spend more. And you can't blame them, right? There's not a lot of supports. China doesn't have a modern national health sector that subsidizes stuff. A lot of people have to bribe their doctor. So there's just a lot of insecurity amongst the common Chinese people. And a lot of that translates into a hesitancy to spend and a preference to save, because you never know what's going to happen. And it would be better to have as much savings as you can available for when shit does hit the fan. So changing that mindset would require a lot of money on public services, which, as I've described, isn't really something that they can do right now. Or it would require the government do something to increase the broader confidence and sentiment of the public, which isn't going to happen because the public doesn't really trust the government that much. Maybe that would surprise people. Maybe not as familiar with China, you might think it's an authoritarian country with a long history of the government being sort of sacrosanct and paramount in Chinese society. But actually what you'll find is that while people recognize the legitimacy of the government and generally prefer to have a large government that is active in managing the economy and various other affairs in society, that doesn't mean that people trust it. Like, in general, pretty much everybody in China mistrusts the government to varying degrees. That doesn't mean they want to overthrow it or that they would prefer another government. Just that they know that it's not really trustworthy. That's a very common sentiment. So that being the case, then it's hard for the government to change that sentiment, just because it's so ingrained over time and reinforced by the government's own behavior, which is generally pretty untrustworthy in nature.
Opaque political system.
Yeah, it's kind of a structural problem for opaque political systems. So I hope that answers the question as to what's the deal with the Chinese economy. That's a rough summary of what's going on right now. And I would point out, too, that while the Chinese economy did underperform last year, it still grew at about 5%, which for a $18 trillion economy is actually pretty decent. The U.S. economy isn't too much bigger. What is it, like $25 trillion or whatever at this point? And we were around 2 to 3%. Something in that range. And that was actually considered healthy for an economy the size of the U.S. is. So for China to be clipping in at 5%, it's still pretty decent. It's not 8%, which is what they had been for much of the 90s and aughts, and what the Communist Party of China had been hoping would continue to define growth in China and its economy, but didn't pan out that way. So yes, China's economy is slowing. Yes, they have a number of structural problems. But the medium to long-term implication of those problems is probably more of just a slowing economy that cannot generate enough opportunities for most of its people, including its most educated people. And so that's a recipe for stagnation, but not implosion. So I would be very skeptical of some of the most dramatic forecasts vis-a-vis China's economy. Just be wary about that. But otherwise, it is in kind of a long-term, slow-motion decline. That much I would agree with. Also, I would not read too much into stock markets in China. They're not actually, well, like I said, China's financial markets are not mature. Like, they haven't really developed that much. They're still pretty new. So stock markets in China tend not to function like stock markets in the rest of the world, in places that have more mature financial systems. Stock markets in China tend to be mostly the reserve of either government investors, state-owned banks, or maybe occasionally the wealthy elite, if they want to spend their money on that kind of stuff. But it's not really a competitive market where you get a lot of people bringing their savings to the table to try to compete for the best stocks. Like, that's not really what's happening. It's much more institutional in nature. In fact, I don't even think retail investors were allowed to invest in stock markets in China until maybe a year or two ago. Before that, it was pretty much all institutional investors. So it's just not quite there yet. And, correspondingly, like with any, nascent financial market, stock markets in China tend to be very frothy. In other words, they tend to be very volatile. They significantly increase in value. They collapse in value. They're all over the place. And the government makes that worse by trying to bail out investors because they don't want retail investors to lose their savings. But in turn, that creates a moral hazard, and so nothing changes. In so much as stock markets in China are worth following, the Hang Seng in Hong Kong is probably the only one, because that's Hong Kong, obviously has lost a lot of political freedom over the past few years, but the party does see value in maintaining its status as a major trading center. And of course, a big part of that is the Hong Kong stock market. So that stock market also has a special conduit. They have some weird wonky name for it. Basically, it has a deal with the Shanghai Stock Exchange, which allows for Chinese companies that are not normally allowed to list overseas to list on Hong Kong's market. Mind you, in terms of regulations, Hong Kong is kind of still treated as a separate entity from mainland China. So that's what I mean when I say overseas. Technically, Chinese companies that cannot invest overseas, including in Hong Kong, or that cannot list rather overseas, including in Hong Kong, because of this conduit, they do have a path to do that. It's still not a direct path. They're not actually listing on Hong Kong stock market. What they're doing is they're creating special corporate vehicles, basically shell corporations, that the company explicitly backs, and that they promise, pinky swear, that they will treat the stocks in the Hong Kong stock market like the stocks were actually those of the company, instead of those of a shell corporation that the company is using as a proxy. Technically, they don't have to do that, which introduces a little bit of extra risk, but generally it's people looking for risk that are investing in the first place in Chinese stock markets at this point, so not too big a deal in the grand scheme of things. But the takeaway here is that Hang Seng, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, is the only one where market forces are actually working as they're supposed to, and so those are the only ones that are really kind of worth following. The stock markets in China that are struggling are the ones in places like Shanghai or Shenzhen, and those are not really competitive markets, and as such, I would not use their performance as an indicator for the health of the overall Chinese economy. Did any of that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. It gets harder to tell the older I get. The wonkier the material, and the further away from grad school I get, the less sure I am that the stuff I'm talking about is being described in a way that's kind of understandable.
Mm-hmm.
So feedback is appreciated in that regard. Actually, I should do the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. Participation by chat is encouraged. I don't read chat while we do this, but I always go through it after. So, I will get all of the feedback. And I definitely do enjoy it, even if it's not always serious. Even if chat is more busy arguing about gun control or Israel, it's always interesting, and it always gives you new information to work with. So please do contribute in that regard.
Chat says, we love Agent Smith. People drew up arrows pointing at that.
Well, very kind of him. I don't think I deserve it, but thank you.
You definitely do. People have asked. Colony Advance was asking earlier if you were going to be on. Dagnip always asks. It's a good reminder. Sometimes I forget. I had people ask me yesterday, is there Agent Smith tomorrow? And I was like, man, we never planned that shit. I think we have planned it a couple times a day in advance.
Yeah. I never really know until like the day of. I was still preparing. I was still keeping the time slot open last week because I wasn't sure if it would happen.
Yeah. What was I doing last week?
So then I got some extra gaming in instead.
Hell yeah. What were you playing?
I started up Distant Worlds finally. It's been in my library for 5 years, maybe longer. It's one of those games that you buy and think you're going to play when you have more time, and then you never have more time.
Yeah.
And then one day you either finally have more time or you just say, fuck it, my life is fucked, so let's do it. So I went for it, and I'm learning how to play. Distant Worlds is one of those Matrix games. Matrix Games is a company that makes just very complicated, convoluted games. So just learning how to play a Matrix game is frequently an experience unto itself. You're talking about rules, manuals, wikis, going on and just looking at the community on Reddit to figure out like just tips and tricks and little bits of insider knowledge that you can't get anywhere else. I did a lot of that. That was just the prelude to actually playing the game. I finally did actually start a game, my first one, and I'm currently just desperately struggling through that. It's there's quite the learning curve, and there's new bumps in the road every day. I think just the other day I had a new colony just get attacked by pirates, and that was expected. So I had sent 2 escorts and a frigate to protect it, thinking that would be enough. And then the pirates attacked with half a dozen frigates and half a dozen destroyers.
Oh, no.
It went very poorly. I was not aware that was a thing that could happen. So I ended up cutting a deal with the pirates to pay them protection money, which actually is what they call it in-game. There is protection money in-game, and I had to resort to that. So I've been doing that, been playing some HOTS, a little bit of Stellaris, although I think the game I was playing was kind of reaching its logical conclusion, so I kind of got away from that. There comes a point in every Stellaris game's life when you eventually have to just pull the plug, because there's not any logical stopping point ever in a Stellaris game. You just kind of have to stop when you think the time is right.
Is it just when you get bored? Because there's like always
it's not even necessarily when you get bored. It's more just when there's nothing of substance left to do. There's always stuff to do in the Stellaris game. Even after the late game crisis, there's more you could do depending on what kind of objectives you want to set for yourself. But a lot of it is kind of redundant. So it's not necessarily boring, but you kind of have to make the judgment of whether the time would be better spent on something else, like, say, a new game of Stellaris.
Yep.
And so once that threshold is hit, you kind of have to pull the plug and then move on. So that's kind of where I got with that particular game.
Makes sense. I've been playing more of my Baldur's Gate 3 honor run.
Oh yeah, how's that going?
Made it to level 5, still alive. We
Still
just
alive.
fought the drow in the cave who's mean to all the little gnomes. I own that guy.
Oh, right. Okay.
I feel like I've been getting better at the fundamental of pressing T to see more information about the spells and what the enemies can do.
Yes. That's a very useful mechanic. I loved that.
Extremely strong, because he does a spell that mind controls one of your characters, which is super strong, and it lasts for 4 turns, and I was like, this is stupid strong. Mouse over it, and it says it breaks if they take any non-psychic damage. So I just had Scratch bite my character, and they're fine. So I take like 4 damage, and then I'm out of it. So, yeah, little plays like that end up allowing you to work around these kind of spells is really good. One of my previous honor run attempts wiped on the Hag because I didn't mouse over the Hag and see that whenever you cast a spell in range of her, she spawns illusions. So I didn't notice that until it was too late, and there were like 9 hags, and my whole party was hold position. So next time we're gonna get her. Yeah. I might try to get her the next time I play because I'm of that level, and I fought through the Underdark a little bit, so I'm almost into Act 2 on this run.
Gotcha.
But I have a rogue monk as my main character. I think that's the only multi-class one I have right now. Yeah, so it's basically I get a bunch of really high sneak attack damage with a bow, while my Karlak Barbarian and then Cleric and Paladin are all kind of in the shit, and then mixing in some monk kung fu shit is just always awesome. Toppling people, flurry of blows. There's a rogue spec called Thief where you get 2 bonus actions, and monks get to punch people with bonus actions, so you basically get way more punches in by being a rogue monk.
Oh, fancy business.
Yeah.
Rogue monk. Interesting concept.
Yeah.
And that's different than the, what was it, the Bard? I think I could have sworn you made a Bard.
Oh, the Bard died. Yeah.
Oh, that was, okay, that was the honor run. All right.
Yeah, I had a monk, just a normal, like, I guess it's the 4 elements kind of monk. That campaign is on tactician difficulty, and it technically is still open. I ended up reinstalling all of my Baldur's Gate game files and stuff onto a different hard drive, so it's on the solid state drive, and also because I had some mods to my game, which means that the achievements don't work anymore. So I would have felt really bad if I like completed an honor run and then I don't get credit for that because I have different lewd body type mods. It's like, why am I being punished for this? They're like, no, any mods and you don't get any achievements.
There you go.
But they're purely aesthetic. I don't care. Still doesn't count. And I played Dota with Trisha today. That's always
oh yeah, I saw the end of that.
Yeah. We had an epic like 56-minute game.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yep. Dota is a really hype and beautiful game. A lot of people in my community who have been historically StarCraft players are currently biding their time in Dota. There's a major race to be the next big RTS game because StarCraft 2 development has been dead for like 8 years or something. That's what it feels like. So Frostgiant is working on Stormgate. Sunspear is working on Immortal Gates of Pyre. And then Zero Space is another competitor that recently just jumped out there and has been allowing streaming of their games. So we'll see.
Yeah, there's been a bunch of layoffs at Blizzard recently.
Yeah, part of the Microsoft acquisition.
Yeah. The whole industry has been laying people off, but just recently, Blizzard in particular, Microsoft announced a bunch of layoffs across its whole gaming portfolio. So it's not clear if there's going to be much change as far as updates and maybe a pickup in the game. People in the HOTS community had been watching that because they were hoping that maybe the Microsoft acquisition would mean maybe a little more attention paid to HOTS, but the layoffs are making it look like that's not going to be the case. So probably going to stay in maintenance mode.
Yeah.
For the foreseeable future.
Yeah, HOTS is a very good game. I played it a couple times during my subathon. It's a very good viewer game because it doesn't require as much reading of like what all the items do because it has no items. So it felt like if you're a brand new HOTS player, you can do decently effective stuff in a game. But if you're a brand new Dota player, you're just food for the slaughter, pretty much.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I have to know, did your girlfriend bring you a sandwich?
Yes. My woman.
Wow, okay. That's pretty nice.
It is nice.
Professional streamer, play video games all day, and your hot girlfriend brings you a sandwich while you do it. Damn, Neuro. Damn, you won the lottery. Man.
Have you seen The Matrix? Whenever Neo does some crazy shit and Morpheus is just like, he's the one. I felt a little bit of that whenever she came through the door with a sandwich. I was like, what in the earth?
Well played.
Yeah.
You're a very lucky man. You're living the dream.
Yeah.
Have you, by the way, before we go, because I know we're about out of time, Sins of a Solar Empire, have you ever played that?
No.
Okay. Of all the 4X Builder games, and I know you've played a number of them by now, that's the one that I think you would like the best, because it's actually the one that's the most like an RTS. It effectively is an RTS. But there is expansion, exploration, it has an in-game market. It's got a lot of different mechanics that kind of give it a lot more depth than a lot of RTS games bother with.
You said that was Sins of a Slower Empire, like as opposed to a faster one? That's Star.
Yes, the games can take a while. It's true. I concede the point. But I think you would find it, at the very least, interesting. And they're also working on a sequel, which has technically been released on Epic Games, although I think it's like a beta or something. It's going to be an Epic Games exclusive for a while. Eventually, it'll be released on Steam. If it had not been an Epic Games exclusive, I probably would have heard about it. I didn't hear about it until last year, when it had already been out on the market for a while, which kind of blew my mind. I didn't think I'd ever hear about Sins of a Solar Empire again, but damn, there it is, Sins of a Solar Empire 2, right out there on the market.
Nice. Chad's
So,
asking
I
me
don't
if
know.
you played Anno 1800.
No, not Anno 1800. I did play Anno 2250, whatever it was. Well, wait, no, I think it was more like 2050. Yeah, 21. There was a 2150 edition of Anno which took place on like the moon or something. But there was another one that was like 2050, which took place in a post-environmental global warming, post-global warming world. Well, not even that's right. Basically, the world flooded. There was a big environmental disaster, and so you're sort of in the near future, and you have to manage your economy either by playing as a faction that doesn't give a fuck about the environment, or one that does. And in practice, you're probably going to end up having both in your colony. But the degree to which you have both kind of varies depending on player preference and depending on the objectives on a given map. So I did play that, but I've not played 1800. And probably won't, because the Anno games are fun, but I feel like if you played one, you pretty much played them all. Because I did try to play Anno Venice. What was it? It was like Anno 1600, and then the expansion was Venice. I did try to play that, and I just found it so similar to 2050 that I didn't really get into it too much. You know, maybe that's on me for not being more patient with it, but you know, after a while, I mean, there's only so long that you can just kind of let the colony run itself, right? There is room for creativity in Anno. I do enjoy the game, but I enjoy it in short bursts. You know, maybe once every 4 years, I guess is where I'm at. I'm not a frequent player of it at this point, I can't say. But yeah, there is merit to it, but I don't feel like there's enough variation in the gameplay to warrant coming back to it all that often. And I grant you that I haven't played 1800 or 2150, or basically any but 1600 or 2050. So I can't speak to those games. Maybe they're done in a different way. Maybe they're done better. Or maybe I'm just bad at the game. That's also quite likely. So it could be my experience of the game was colored by my own ineptitude. So maybe I'm just playing the game wrong. That could be true too.
Man, that throws me back to the 2006 thing we would say was mad because you're bad.
Yeah, that could be. I don't think I was too terrible, but yeah, it could be I was missing out on the point of the game. Because there is some combat in the game, but I pretty much ignored it just to focus on building the colony. You know, the Anno series is known for economic management. Like, that's its sort of raison d'etre, so that was what I homed in on. But maybe I missed out on some stuff by kind of eschewing the more violent side of the game.
Yeah, makes me think of Endless Space. That was a game where I played, I think, the super science-oriented kind of pacifist aliens one of my runs, and I was playing very defensively, not really attacking anyone. And then you can play the space bird people, and they have veterancy from combat. So the more you get in the shit, the stronger your military becomes over time. So you're basically incentivized to start attacking, and that's one of your main ways of expanding your horizons.
Yeah. Yeah, Endless Space is a good one. And the sequel was good as well, as I recall. But I haven't been back to it either too much.
Oh. Well, to kind of wrap up here, one of the things I'm reading right now in the American Nations book, going back to that, is the common struggle that the different regions face. So I've gone over all the different regions now that are at least involved in the revolution, at least early on. And they're talking about the pressures applied with the duties on their goods, like the tobacco and cotton and whatever else they were sending over to Britain. And then also how they didn't get as many benefits as a British citizen would. So for them, their tax burden felt like they weren't really getting anything from it. And then to impose additional duties on that was annoying. And one of the funny things about this time period was it was very popular for monarchs to kind of shuffle whatever their religion was. So if one monarch was disposed by another one, you might be mandated to be a different religion, or not necessarily mandated, but they install people who are very aggressively enforcing those rules into a region. And the US was basically foisted upon itself a whole bunch of different subgenres of Christianity. From sometimes you get a Catholic person who's in control and they're imposing Catholic shit. Other times the Puritans are fucking shit up and they're enforcing their rules on people. Or now we're Anglican, and being Anglican is the coolest. And if you're not Anglican, you're wrong. Or I think one of the ones that upset everyone was whenever they wanted to put people in charge of all the churches, including the American Anglican churches. They said, your leadership is no longer valid. We're going to have the clergy over there as well, which would give them religious control in addition to the local government control. So things are starting to boil. I got to the dumping of the tea into the Boston Harbor, which many people, they clapped at that in the U.S. They were like, whoever did that, we endorse this kind of action. This is funny. But Britain was very upset about it. That was a lot of money that they just threw into the water in protest.
Yeah, the East India Company was not very popular at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we still need to do that revolution coordination thing with
Echefetum,
yeah.
Yeah, I should poke him about that. He's been busy with fatherhood recently.
Yeah. I kind of didn't want to bother him specifically for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
I'd kind of been thinking about it intermittently over the past year, and I was like, his kid has probably been born by now, so he's probably going to be busy with that for like the next 6 months to a year at least.
Yeah, there's that in I guess as the child grows up a little bit, you get more free time, but I think whenever you have a newborn baby, you don't get to sleep and you basically need to be watching it all the time. Yeah. So it's super intensive at the beginning, but as they get older and they can go to school, then you get a bit of free time again.
Yeah, exactly.
Very high impact stuff trying to raise a new child.
Yeah, I should have tried to do it earlier.
Mm.
But as Dagnip can attest, I can be quite interminable in my delays.
That's funny. It's a good sentence. I can be quite interminable in my delays. I like putting stuff on the back burner as well. One of the things that I have on the back burner that's next to me, because I'm trying to make myself work on it, is the sci-fi project that Kukio and I thought of many years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found my old notepads and stuff. So I have the timeline written out, I have the different species, and I have like 14 characters written out. It's pretty comprehensive. There are also sketches of a bunch of the different species in it too. So that's one of those things where it's such a massive project to build a sci-fi universe that it's kind of hard to just find the motivation to chip away at it on a regular basis. And then one of the things that definitely makes me hesitant that I could do better at is I feel like I'm not a super good writer, and I feel like the ideas are good, but I don't know if I have the writing skill to do it well enough. But that's just my own kind of self-doubt. I should just send it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Slam out some shit. There's a lot of bad sci-fi out there. It'll be right at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair point. Yeah, got to take the first step and just get through the process of learning through struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Sooner you start, the sooner you finish.
There's a bunch of Scientology stuff here in L.A. L. Ron Hubbard was a very prolific sci-fi writer, and then he realized there's way more money in religion, so just made a few different notes, and a lot of people are still into it even to this day.
Well, they were very good at using networks to their advantage. Because there was a lot of, in Hollywood, it's all about networking, right? It's a services sector, sort of abstract type job. It's not really about how many widgets you can produce per hour. It's more about more ephemeral factors like, your looks, your personality, your vibe. And, there's lots of attractive people around the country. So they're all competing for that, those few jobs in Hollywood that are going to be like their big break. So being able to get your foot in the door really depends on the people you know.
Yeah.
And so being able to get into networks that are well connected is one of the big ways that you get ahead. And Scientology was really good about doing that. They were really good about getting people who were well connected into the institution. And the more connected people were in the institution, the stronger their selling point was. That being that they could give people a leg up if they joined. And so that was how they really kind of built their brand for a long time and managed to stay relevant, even though they believed some patently wild shit. Probably stuff that a lot of people who joined did not give a shit about. But, if you meet a guy at a party and he says, I'm really into Scientology. Oh, by the way, I could probably recommend you for this job, and it would really help you out. You're kind of well inclined to kind of look past it in order to build that relationship and cultivate that node in your network.
Yep. But then sometimes you get propagandized and you become a believer yourself. Stay safe out there.
Yeah, got to be careful.
The cultists are out to get you.
Could be easier to get along just to get along and then end up kind of adopting some bad habits over time. Yeah, sort of radicalization by osmosis. Well, I'm sure you'll be able to avoid that.
Yes. I'm not interested in what they have to offer. I have learned about the inception of said organization and know that it is not something that is grounded in truth and fact and things that I'm motivated to worship. So, alas, they will need to find a different customer for their very expensive faith. Well, appreciate you coming on, Fuzzy Court. Thank you for handling questions today, and thank you, chat, for giving us some boisterous dialogue. You'll have a fun chat to read whenever I publish this VOD. Apparently there was a lot of propaganda being thrown about for the Russia-Ukraine situation, so you can probably break that down. Yeah.
It always is. And we didn't even get to Israel.
Yeah, true. Well, last time we mentioned it, and you were like, status quo.
Yeah, pretty much status quo, but there has been some assassinations, and we talked a little bit about the U.S. troops who died in Jordan.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a broader issue there in Iraq and Syria that we haven't talked about yet. So we'll get to that next time.
Well, cool.
But yeah, thank you for having me on. Always a privilege. I hope the sandwich was good. It looked delicious.
Heck yeah. I give you your weekly challenge of a 20-minute walk. I think it's...
yeah, I did that.
I did
that with the push-ups, yeah.
Good. Then I'll give you the same.
Very well.
Keep it up. So. I wish you fortitude in resisting the call of the snacks that are not the best for you. But you can treat yourself a little bit. Moderation.
I'm going to have a sandwich, for sure. You've got me hungry now. That's not fair. Tempting me with sandwiches.
He's been activated. Well, you take care of yourself and enjoy your sandwich. Ladies and gentlemen, we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.